It was late evening in Brooklyn, and the city buzzed faintly in the distance, muffled by the walls of Emily's cozy apartment. She had always loved the energy of New York, the way life thrummed through its veins day and night. But tonight, the hum felt different, more distant, more isolated. For the first time in a long while, Emily was alone. Her parents had left for a few days to visit family upstate, leaving her in charge of the apartment. At 21, she was used to independence, living in Brooklyn while attending college. Still, she had never spent an entire night alone in their place before. She tried to push the unease aside, reminding herself that she was safe inside the well-secured apartment. But as night fell, a strange tension crept into her mind. The first odd sound came around midnight, a faint tapping, almost imperceptible. Emily had just finished watching a movie on her laptop, curled up under a blanket on the couch when she heard it. Her breath caught, and she sat still, listening. It was coming from the window in the kitchen. Tap, tap, tap. She stood up slowly, her heart thudding in her chest as she moved cautiously towards the kitchen. The fire escape was just outside the window. Emily peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing there. No one. It's the wind, she told herself, even though the night was unnervingly still. She checked the lock on the window just to be safe and went back to the living room, trying to shake off the nervousness. She texted her best friend Lisa, jokingly telling her she was getting spooked by shadows. "Haha, you're fine. It's probably just a rat or something. Want to FaceTime?" Lisa replied. Emily smiled at the message, feeling a little better. She picked up her laptop and went to her bedroom, shutting the door behind her for extra comfort. But as she settled into bed and opened her laptop to call Lisa, the tapping sound returned, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. Emily froze. The sound wasn't coming from the kitchen anymore. It was coming from her bedroom window. Her heart raced as she turned her head slowly towards the window that overlooked the alley. A shadow moved outside. Someone was standing on the fire escape. She scrambled off the bed, rushing to the window to check the locks. They were secure, but the figure outside wasn't going anywhere. A silhouette lingered just beyond the glass, barely visible in the dim streetlight. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she backed away. The figure tapped again, this time with deliberate slowness, as if taunting her. Emily grabbed her phone with trembling hands and called the police. As she explained the situation, she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The operator's calm voice did little to ease her panic. "Stay calm, ma'am. Units are on their way. Stay where you are and lock the door." Emily hung up and immediately bolted to the bedroom door, turning the lock. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the window. The shadow was still there, motionless now, watching. She couldn't see any features, just a dark outline. Minutes stretched into an eternity as she waited for the sound of sirens, but all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It slinked off the fire escape, vanishing into the night like smoke dissipating in the wind. Emily's knees felt weak as she collapsed onto her bed. "It's over," she thought, but her relief was short-lived. Suddenly, the silence of the apartment was shattered by the unmistakable creak of the front door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Hadn't she locked it? "I did lock it," she thought. Her heart raced, the realization sinking in that someone, he, had managed to get inside. Panic surged through her as she heard slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the living room floor. She darted into the closet, closing the door softly behind her, pressing her ear against it. The footsteps stopped just outside her bedroom. The doorknob rattled. She covered her mouth with her hands to stifle her breathing, praying that the lock would hold. For a moment, the apartment was deathly quiet. Then she heard the faintest click, the sound of the door unlocking. Her blood turned to ice as the door creaked open. The intruder was inside. Emily crouched in the closet, her whole body trembling. She could hear him moving around the room, slow, methodical. Drawers opened, furniture was shifted, as though he was searching for something, or someone. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Lisa was calling her back, but Emily quickly silenced it, her thumb shaking as she pressed the button. The faint noise seemed deafening in the small enclosed space. The footsteps stopped. Emily's breath hitched. He had heard. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it. She felt like she might pass out from the tension. The footsteps started again, heading towards the closet. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from making any sound. Emily's entire body tensed as the closet door slowly opened, and for a split second, she locked eyes with the man standing on the other side. His face was hidden in the shadows, but she could see enough to know that he wasn't just a burglar. He was something far worse. In a blind panic, she lunged forward, slamming the door into his face and bolting past him. She sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline pushing her faster than she thought possible. Behind her, the man recovered quickly, his footsteps thundering after her. Emily ran into the kitchen, fumbling for the back door. It was jammed. Her hands shook as she tried to twist the lock. The man's heavy breathing grew closer. In a final desperate move, she grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and turned to face him. But he wasn't there. The apartment was deathly quiet again, the only sound her own gasping breaths. She stood there, knife in hand, waiting, her back pressed against the counter. Minutes passed, but no one came. Had he left? Or was he hiding, waiting for her to make the next move? Suddenly, she heard the faint wail of police sirens approaching in the distance. Relief flooded her body, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The man could still be inside. When the police arrived, they stormed the apartment, clearing each room methodically. They found no one, but the evidence of his presence was undeniable. The lock on her front door had been picked, and her bedroom showed signs of a violent search. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the night. As they questioned her, Emily couldn't stop shaking. The police reassured her they would patrol the area, but deep down, she knew he had been there for her. This wasn't just a random break-in. He had been watching her, and somehow, she knew it wasn't over. As the police left, Emily sat alone in the apartment, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. A single message appeared on the screen. "I'll be back." Her blood ran cold. Whoever he wasn't done with her yet. Chloe had never been afraid of being alone. At 20 years old, she was independent, smart, and self-sufficient. So when her parents announced they were heading out of town for the weekend to visit relatives, she wasn't worried. In fact, she was excited for a couple of quiet nights to herself in their spacious suburban home. Her parents left that Friday afternoon with cheerful waves and promises to call. Chloe waved back from the porch and then headed inside to enjoy her solitude. She had plans to binge-watch her favorite shows, maybe order some takeout, and just relax. That first evening was uneventful. Chloe made dinner, watched a movie, and lounged on the couch with her phone. By midnight, she felt the weight of sleep pulling her eyelids down. She locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went upstairs to her bedroom. But as she lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, something gnawed at the edge of her consciousness. A faint click echoed through the house. Her eyes snapped open, and her heart thudded. She listened intently, waiting to hear if the sound repeated, but everything remained still and silent. "It's just the house settling," she reassured herself. The next morning, Chloe awoke to the bright sun filtering through her curtains. She stretched, feeling slightly foolish for being spooked the night before. But as she wandered downstairs to the kitchen, she froze. The back door, the door she was certain she had locked, was slightly ajar. A cold chill ran down her spine. She cautiously approached it, peeking out into the backyard. Nothing seemed amiss. The wind, maybe? She closed the door, turning the lock firmly, and tried to brush off the unsettling feeling creeping into her mind. The day passed uneventfully, but Chloe couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. As night fell again, she found herself double-checking the locks on all the windows and doors. She laughed at herself, feeling ridiculous, but couldn't shake the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. That evening, as Chloe sat in the living room watching TV, the light in the hallway flickered. It was quick, barely noticeable, but her stomach twisted with dread. She stood up and went to investigate, but the light seemed fine. She reached for the switch, flipping it on and off. No flicker. "Get a grip, Chloe. You're just being paranoid," she scolded herself. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered like an unwanted shadow. Later that night, as she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she heard it again, that faint click. It was closer this time, more distinct. She held her breath, listening, her pulse racing. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of floorboards creaking downstairs. Chloe sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Maybe it's the pipes or the wind, she thought, trying to rationalize the noise. but the creaking continued, as though someone was slowly walking through the house. Her mouth went dry. She grabbed her phone and opened the camera app, using the dim light of the screen to guide her as she crept out of bed. She tiptoed down the hall, each step measured and cautious. She paused at the top of the stairs, her eyes fixed on the darkened first floor. And then she saw it, a shadow moving across the window in the living room. Her breath caught in her throat. The shape was tall, human-like. Chloe's mind raced. No, it can't be. She backed away from the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. Had someone broken in? Just as she reached her bedroom door, a loud thud echoed from downstairs. Chloe gasped, her hands trembling. Someone's in the house. She hurried into her room, shutting and locking the door behind her. She grabbed her phone with shaky fingers and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady. There's someone in my house, Chloe whispered, trying to keep her voice low. I think they broke in. Stay on the line, help is on the way, the operator assured her. Suddenly, a new sound filled the air. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, climbing the stairs. Chloe's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the wall, her breaths shallow and frantic. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside her door. She covered her mouth to stifle her breathing as the doorknob slowly turned. Chloe's heart felt like it would burst out of her chest. She could hear the faint sound of someone breathing just on the other side. The door didn't open, but she knew whoever it was, they were waiting. Chloe's mind raced. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit there. Carefully, she moved toward the closet and slipped inside, trying not to make a sound. She huddled in the corner, clutching her phone, still connected to the 911 operator. She had just enough signal to whisper into the phone. "He's outside my door." The operator's voice was calming. "Stay hidden, Chloe. The police are almost there." Suddenly, the door to her bedroom burst open with a loud crash. Chloe stifled a scream as she heard heavy footsteps entering the room. Her entire body tensed, barely able to breathe as she listened to the intruder search the room. The footsteps came closer, stopping right in front of the closet. Chloe's mind screamed for her to run, but her body was frozen in place. The doorknob rattled, and then, to her horror, it began to open. At that exact moment, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. The footsteps retreated quickly, and Chloe heard the intruder bolt down the stairs and out the back door. Moments later, the house was flooded with the blue and red lights of police cars. Chloe staggered out of the closet, shaking uncontrollably, as officers stormed the house. One of them approached her, his expression gentle. "You're safe now. We've got him," he said. Chloe barely registered his words, her mind still spinning with terror. As the police led her outside, she saw them escorting her neighbor, Mr. Richardson, out of the house in handcuffs. The kind old man who lived next door, always so friendly, always smiling. Chloe's stomach churned with nausea. Later, the police told her that Mr. Richardson had been under investigation for years. He was suspected of several murders, all young women who had lived alone. They had never had enough evidence to arrest him. Until now. Chloe stood outside, watching as the police took him away. The weekend that was supposed to be a quiet retreat had turned into a nightmare. She shuddered, thinking about how close she had come to being his next victim. Even with Mr. Richardson in custody, Chloe knew she would never feel truly safe in her home again. The house was quiet, too quiet for Kate's liking. It was her first weekend alone in the sprawling suburban home, and while the prospect of having the place to herself had initially seemed appealing, now it only heightened her unease. Her family had gone away for the weekend, leaving her to tend to the house. It was just 2 nights, she had told herself, 2 peaceful nights of relaxation. But now, as the late autumn sun dipped below the horizon, shadows crept across the empty streets, and the quiet became oppressive. Kate had settled on the couch with a book, the soft hum of the living room lamp her only company. The occasional distant bark of a dog, or the faint sound of a passing car was the only reminder that she wasn't completely isolated. But then came the knock. At first, it was soft, barely audible. Kate furrowed her brow and glanced toward the front door, her heart skipping a beat. She sat still, straining her ears, but there was nothing. She brushed it off, probably just her imagination. But when the knock came again, a bit louder this time, she felt a chill run down her spine. Kate stood and walked to the door, her steps tentative. She peeked through the peephole, but the porch was empty, bathed only in the dull glow of the street lamp. She opened the door cautiously, expecting to see some neighborhood kids playing a prank, but there was no one. The quiet street was eerily deserted. With a shrug, she closed the door and locked it, dismissing the incident. But as she turned back to the living room, her phone buzzed, making her jump. It was a text from her mother, asking how she was doing. "Everything's fine," Kate replied, forcing herself to relax. She went back to her book, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But the peace didn't last long. Not even 15 minutes later, she heard it again. This time it wasn't a knock, but a soft thud from above, coming from the attic. Kate's heart thumped in her chest. The attic? It was probably just the house settling, she reasoned. Old houses creaked all the time. Still, something about the noise unnerved her. She tried to push it out of her mind and focused on her book, but her attention was broken when the television suddenly flicked on with a loud burst of static. Kate gasped, dropping her book. The remote sat untouched on the coffee table. She reached for it, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the TV off. The silence returned, but now it felt heavy, like the house itself was watching her. Kate chuckled nervously, convincing herself she was just being paranoid. The house was old. Maybe there was an electrical glitch, she told herself. But then the footsteps started. They were faint at first, coming from the floor above her, as though someone was pacing back and forth. Kate froze, her eyes wide as she looked up toward the ceiling. It couldn't be. She was alone. Or was she? Grabbing her phone, Kate dialed her parents' number, but after the first ring, she stopped herself. What was she going to say? That she was hearing things? They'd just tell her to calm down and stop letting her imagination get the best of her. She ended the call and stood there, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all was silent again. But then, something caught her eye, the coat rack by the front door. The jacket she had hung earlier was now draped across a chair. She hadn't moved it. She knew that. Suddenly, her skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. Slowly, Kate turned toward the large bay window at the front of the house. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows just beyond the glass. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. The rational part of her brain told her to stay calm, but something darker gnawed at her insides. Was someone messing with her? Or was there actually someone in the house? A sudden crash from upstairs made her heart lurch. Without thinking, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and hurried to the stairs. As she ascended, the floorboards creaked under her weight, and she felt every step like a countdown to something horrible. Reaching the second floor, she noticed her bedroom door slightly ajar. She knew she had closed it earlier. Slowly, she pushed the door open with the flashlight in her trembling hand, sweeping the beam across the room. Everything looked normal, except for the closet door, which was now wide open. Kate's breath caught in her throat. The closet door had been shut. With shaking hands, she approached it. The silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. She shone the light into the closet, nothing but clothes hanging neatly. But as she turned to leave, the faintest creak sounded behind her. Kate whirled around, shining the light back into the closet, but saw nothing. Her mind raced. Was someone hiding? Was she losing it? That's when she noticed something. A footprint. A large, muddy footprint on her bedroom floor. Her stomach dropped. Heart pounding, she backed away from the room, trying to stay calm. She had to get out of the house. Whoever was in here, she didn't want to stick around to find out. She bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. She reached for the front door, but before she could unlock it, the sound of a door creaking open behind her made her freeze. Someone was inside. There was no mistaking it now. Kate darted toward the kitchen, the back door her only escape. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. Panic surged through her as she yanked open the back door and stumbled into the cold night air. She could hear them now, following her. Whoever it was, they were toying with her, letting her think she had a chance to escape. Kate sprinted into the backyard, heart pounding in her throat, but her legs felt sluggish. weighed down by fear. She ran to the garden shed, throwing herself inside and locking the door behind her. Darkness enveloped her, and the only sound was her ragged breathing. For a moment, everything was still, but then she heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps outside. They were getting closer. She covered her mouth, trying to stay quiet as tears streamed down her face. The footsteps stopped right outside the shed. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the thin wood of the shed door. Kate's entire body tensed. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a raspy voice. "I know you're in there." Kate's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the back wall, praying the door wouldn't open. The seconds felt like hours, her mind racing with terror. The door handle jiggled, but it didn't budge. There was silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the door swung open. Kate screamed. The light from the house illuminated the figure, a man, tall and lean, with a sickening grin stretched across his face. He stepped inside, his shadow casting an ominous shape over her cowering figure. With a burst of adrenaline, Kate threw open the back window of the shed and scrambled out, her breath coming in gasps. She could hear him laughing behind her, mocking her fear as she bolted toward the neighbor's house. She pounded on the door, but no one answered. The house was dark. Desperate, she spotted her car in the driveway. She had left the keys inside. She ran back toward the house, not caring about the man who was surely still close behind her. She had to get those keys. She had to get out. Inside, Kate tore through the house, grabbing the keys from the kitchen counter. She heard footsteps behind her again. He was inside the house now. She could feel his presence, his breath on her neck, but she didn't turn around. Fumbling with the lock, she threw the front door open and darted to her car. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely get the key into the ignition. The man was almost at the front door now, his silhouette framed by the dim porch light. The engine roared to life, and Kate floored the gas pedal. The car sped down the quiet suburban street, leaving the house and the man behind. She didn't stop until she reached a well-lit gas station miles away, her entire body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Kate stared into the rearview mirror, expecting to see him behind her, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty road. She was safe, for now. But the memory of that night would haunt her forever. My name is Ethan, and I live in a small, isolated town on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. It's peaceful out here, no traffic, no noise, just miles of forest surrounding my little house, with the nearest neighbor being a good 10-minute drive away. It's the kind of place you go to get away from everything, where you can feel truly alone. I've always liked that, or at least I thought I did. It all started last summer, one of those scorching August afternoons when the air feels heavy and thick. I was sitting on my porch sipping iced tea when I saw him. He came walking up my driveway, looking tired and dusty, his clothes worn from what seemed like a long journey. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a hiker who got lost, or someone whose car broke down. People get turned around out here all the time. As he approached, he gave me a wave, a small, polite gesture that immediately made me lower my guard. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he called out, his voice steady and calm. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down a few miles back. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call a tow." He seemed normal enough. Early 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. Nothing about him screamed danger. And out here, where strangers are rare, you kind of feel obligated to help when someone shows up at your doorstep. So I invited him in. I know, it was stupid. But hindsight's always 20/20ths, right? Inside, he thanked me again, dialing the number for the tow service while I grabbed him a glass of water. "Name's Charlie, by the way," he said, flashing me a friendly smile. I introduced myself, and we exchanged small talk while he waited on hold. The whole situation felt oddly comfortable, despite the fact that there was a stranger in my house. But after a while, something started to feel off. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it changed, but it was like a shift in the air. He'd been on the phone for a long time, too long, and I noticed he wasn't really talking anymore. just holding the phone to his ear, glancing around my living room like he was casing the place. My gut tightened. "Any luck with the tow?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he just hung up the phone, turned to me and smiled. But this time there was something unsettling about that smile. Something wrong. "Tow truck won't be here for hours," he said, still smiling. "Mind if I wait here for a while?" I didn't like the way he was looking at me. His eyes had a kind of intensity, like he was sizing me up. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but I didn't want to escalate things, so I nodded, telling myself I was overreacting. "Sure, no problem." We sat there in awkward silence, and that's when I noticed he wasn't tired anymore. His earlier exhaustion had evaporated, replaced by an eerie calm. His gaze lingered on the door, then flickered back to me. My pulse quickened. Something was definitely wrong. That's when it hit me. I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter, out of reach, and Charlie was between me and the only exit. I needed to get control of the situation, fast. "So, where exactly did your car break down?" I asked, hoping to buy some time while I thought of a plan. Charlie leaned back in the chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Just a few miles down the road. Funny thing though, I didn't see a single other car. No one around. It's real quiet out here, huh?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Real isolated." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced. I had a flashlight in the garage and an old hunting knife in the shed, but they were both outside. Getting to either one would mean moving past him. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "It's quiet." Then he stood up, stretching his arms slowly. "You live here alone?" The question was casual, but the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, nodding. "Just me and the trees." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "That's nice. No one to bother you. No one to hear if something goes wrong." That was it. The moment I knew I had to act. This guy wasn't stranded. He was here for something else, something far worse. I stood up quickly, trying to keep my movements calm, and made my way toward the kitchen. I needed to get to the phone, but before I could even take 2 steps, he lunged at me, slamming me against the wall. The force knocked the wind out of me, and for a split second, I was sure it was over. "You don't need to do this," I gasped, struggling against his grip. His face twisted into a cruel grin. "Oh, but I do. See, I need your car. I need your stuff, and I don't need you around to get it." Panic surged through me, but then I remembered something. A way out. During my renovations last year, I'd built a small crawl space behind the bookshelf, mostly for storage. It wasn't obvious, and it was my only chance. With all the strength I could muster, I shoved him hard, catching him off guard just enough to break free. I bolted for the living room, yanking the bookshelf aside and squeezing into the crawl space. I pulled the door shut behind me just as I heard him storming after me. Heart pounding, I held my breath, listening to him search the house. He tore through my belongings, smashing furniture and shouting obscenities. I stayed silent, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard the sound of him leaving. The door slammed, followed by the engine of my car roaring to life. He was gone. It took me another hour to work up the courage to come out of the crawl space. When I did, the house was a wreck, but I was alive. I called the police and they found my car abandoned a few miles down the road, but Charlie was long gone. They told me he was an escaped convict, wanted for multiple violent crimes. I still think about that night, about how normal he seemed at first, how easy it was to let my guard down. And I realized something terrifying. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it looks like just another person asking for help. That's what haunts me the most. It was a quiet evening, the kind that lulled you into a sense of security. My family lived in a small house on the edge of town, tucked away from the busier streets. It wasn't exactly rural, but it wasn't close to anyone else either. Just a couple of houses scattered along a lonely road that led into a patch of woods. I was 15 at the time, a regular teenager, and the most excitement we usually got was a stray dog wandering too close to the yard or the occasional power outage. But that night was different. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A faint banging, like someone knocking on the front door. It was strange because no one ever came to our house this late, especially not out here. I thought it might have been my imagination at first, but then it came again, louder. I got up and made my way down the hall. My parents were already in the living room, staring at the door with confused expressions. My dad, being the cautious guy he was, motioned for me to stay back while he approached the door. Through the peephole, he looked out into the night. "Who is it?" my mom asked, her voice uneasy. "I don't know," my dad muttered. "It's some guy. Looks like he's in bad shape." Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped closer. My dad opened the door just a crack, and there he was. A man, mid-30s maybe, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt and blood. He was breathing heavily, eyes wide with fear. "Please," he rasped, "you have to help me. They're coming." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. My dad didn't open the door any further. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice steady but guarded. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows at any moment. "They're after me. They'll be here any minute. I don't have much time. Please, let me in." My mom stepped forward now, concern etched across her face. "You're hurt," she said, but my dad raised a hand to stop her. "Hold on," my dad said, his tone firm. "What's going on? Who's after you?" The man's hands were shaking, and he clutched his side like he was in serious pain. I don't know who they are. They've been following me since I got into town. I think they're trying to kill me." At this point, my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to believe. This guy looked desperate, terrified even, but something about the situation felt off. Like there was more to the story that he wasn't telling us. "We need to call the police," my dad said, glancing at my mom. "Now." But before anyone could move, the man spoke again, his voice trembling. "There's no time. They're already here. You have to let me in." My dad hesitated, and in that brief moment, he turned to look out the side window. That's when he saw them. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 50 feet away, in the trees at the edge of our property, I could make out the faint shapes of figures moving through the darkness, slow, deliberate, like they were hunting something, or someone. "Get away from the windows," my dad ordered, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "Now!" We all stepped back, and my dad, for the first time, opened the door just enough to pull the man inside. He stumbled in, collapsing onto the floor with a grunt of pain. My mom grabbed a towel and pressed it to his wound, while my dad grabbed the phone to call the police. "Please hurry," my mom whispered into the phone. "There are men outside. They're trying to break in." As we waited for the police, the tension in the room grew unbearable. The man on the floor was gasping, his hands stained with his own blood, and outside, the figures were moving closer. We could hear them now, footsteps crunching on the gravel, low murmurs that sounded like they were discussing their next move. My dad, a former Marine, wasn't the kind of guy to sit back and do nothing. He had a small handgun, an old .38 revolver that he kept locked away for emergencies. This qualified as one. He retrieved it from the safe in his bedroom and stationed himself near the front window, keeping an eye on the men outside. "How many of them?" I asked, my voice shaky. "At least 3, my dad replied, eyes narrowed. "Maybe more." Then it happened. A loud bang echoed through the house, a sound like someone kicking at the back door. My mom gasped, clutching the man on the floor a little tighter. "They're trying to get in," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. My dad moved quickly, stepping to the back of the house and shouting through the door, "Get off my property! The police are on their way!" For a moment, there was silence. Then the men outside started yelling, cursing, demanding that we hand over the man. "He's a dead man," one of them shouted. "You can't hide him." My dad didn't flinch. He fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack echoing into the night. That bought us a few seconds of quiet, but it didn't last long. The men regrouped, and we heard footsteps circling the house. They were planning something. It was at that moment that we saw the flash of blue and red lights approaching in the distance. The police. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. One of the men outside yelled something unintelligible, and before we knew it, there was a sudden rush toward the house, like they were making one final push to break in. My dad fired another shot, this time aiming at the ground near the front steps. The men scattered, but not far. Then, like a miracle, the police arrived, 2 squad cars screeching to a stop at the edge of our driveway. The men who had been stalking our house fled into the woods, but the officers were quick. They chased down 2 of them, handcuffed them right there in our yard. As the police secured the scene, we finally let out a collective breath. The man we had led into our home was taken to the hospital, his injuries more serious than we'd realized. The officers told us that he had a criminal record, a history of theft and some violent behavior. But it wasn't clear why those men had been after him. They suspected it was something to do with a robbery gone wrong, maybe a gang dispute. We never found out the full story. What I learned that night, though, was this: not every act of kindness goes unpunished, and sometimes danger comes to your door wrapped in desperation. You never know who you can trust, even when someone is begging for help. And even in a quiet town like ours, the worst kind of evil can be lurking just beyond the tree line. I've lived in Ashbrook my whole life, a small town where nothing ever happens. You know the kind, where everyone waves at each other on the street, and you can't go to the grocery store without running into someone who knows your family. It's the sort of place where people trust their neighbors without a second thought. But that trust is fragile, and I was about to learn just how quickly it could shatter. It all started when Mr. Walters moved in next door. He was in his early 50s, a bit overweight, always dressed in plain clothes. He introduced himself to us on his first day, carrying over a basket of baked goods like something out of an old sitcom. My parents thought he was great, a real good neighbor, they said. But something about him never sat right with me. At first I brushed it off as paranoia. I mean, I'm just a teenager, right? What do I know about people? But then I started noticing things. Mr. Walters would leave his house late at night, well after midnight, and come back just before dawn. Sometimes he was carrying black trash bags that were oddly heavy, and I could swear I saw him digging around in his backyard with a shovel more than once. The first few times I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe he was just doing something weird like composting or working late. But the more I watched, the more it ate at me. One night, I woke up to the sound of his truck revving up. It was 3 a.m., and I couldn't resist sneaking a look from my bedroom window. I saw him throwing something large into the bed of his truck, wrapped tightly in a tarp. It looked heavy. He glanced around nervously, like he was afraid someone was watching. That's when I realized he knew I had been watching. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. I told my best friend Jake about it during lunch. He laughed it off, saying I was probably just imagining things. Come on, man. The guy's probably just a weirdo. It doesn't mean he's up to something illegal, Jake had said, shaking his head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. That night, I kept my lights off and stared out the window, waiting to see if Mr. Walters would make another late-night trip. And he did. Around 2:30 a.m. I saw him again, only this time he wasn't loading his truck. He was standing outside, looking directly at my house, or more specifically, my window. My heart pounded in my chest. I stepped back quickly, hoping he hadn't seen me, but it was too late. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. My mom answered it, and there was Mr. Walters, smiling as usual, holding a small box of cookies. I lingered in the hallway, listening. He chatted with my mom like everything was fine, but as he handed her the box, he asked, "How's your boy doing? Haven't seen him around much." My blood ran cold. He knew, somehow, he knew I'd been watching him. That evening, I decided I had to know what was going on. I waited until my parents were asleep, then slipped out of the house and over to Mr. Walters' yard. There was a faint smell in the air, something rancid. His truck was parked in the driveway, but I noticed something else. Fresh dirt near the back fence. It was dark, but I could see where the grass had been dug up recently. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. A partially exposed tarp sticking out of the ground. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I had to call the police. But before I could dial, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, and there was Mr. Walters, standing in the shadows, smiling that same unnerving smile. "You shouldn't be out here, kid. You never know what kind of people lurk around at night," he said softly, his grip tightening on my arm. I broke free and ran as fast as I could back to my house. I locked the door behind me, my heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night, terrified that he might come for me. The next day, I told my parents everything. At first, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just being a paranoid kid. But I knew what I saw. I made the call to the police myself, and when they showed up, they found more than just freshly dug earth. Behind Mr. Walters' house, buried deep in the soil, were several tarps, each one holding something horrific, human remains. It turned out that Mr. Walters wasn't who he said he was. He had been living under a false identity for years, hiding from his past. He was wanted in several states for the murders of hitchhikers and drifters, people who wouldn't be missed. He'd move from town to town, blending in, earning trust, and then he'd strike. The news of his arrest shocked the town. People couldn't believe it. This man who brought cookies to his neighbors and waved at passers-by had been hiding a dark secret. But I'll never forget the way he smiled at me that night, as if daring me to do something. True evil can wear a friendly face, and sometimes the monsters live next door. I've been on the road for over 20 years. I've seen it all. Long stretches of empty highway, the occasional accident, strange characters in the dead of night. Driving a rig across the country, you get used to the loneliness, the rhythm of the engine humming beneath you, and the miles ticking away. But there's one night, one stretch of road that still keeps me up sometimes. No matter how many times I try to forget it, it creeps back into my mind, especially when I find myself alone in the dark, with nothing but the road ahead and my thoughts. It was around 3 in the morning, one of those graveyard shifts where the highway stretches out forever, and you haven't seen another vehicle for what feels like hours. I was hauling a load through northern Arizona, along a highway that cuts through the desert, one of those isolated roads where the only light comes from your own headlights. That night, the weather had taken a nasty turn. A storm had rolled in fast, the rain coming down in sheets. The wipers on my truck were working overtime, but the visibility was next to nothing. The fog didn't help, rolling in like a thick blanket, making the desert look like something out of a dream, a bad one. Normally, I'm comfortable in those conditions. I've driven through every kind of weather you can imagine, but that night, something felt off. It was a gnawing feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be out there, like I was trespassing on some forgotten piece of land. I chalked it up to the weather at first. After all, driving in the middle of a storm on an empty road in the dead of night, anyone would feel uneasy. I turned the radio up to cut through the tension, but the static hissed through the speakers. No stations out there, no signals. Just me and the sound of rain hammering the roof of the cab. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, through the fog, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't moving, just standing there. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt as the truck skidded. My rig lurched forward, and I fought to keep it steady, the wheels straining under my grip. For a split second, I saw them clearly. Someone, or something, dressed in white. A person? Couldn't have been. They didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react, nothing. I braced myself for impact, certain I was about to hit them. But then, just like that, they were gone. Vanished into the fog. I felt the truck slam into the side of the road, the wheels slipping on the wet dirt, and everything spun out of control. The world flipped. Metal screamed, glass shattered. I remember the crushing sound as the cab rolled, then darkness. When I came to, I was still inside the cab, upside down, strapped into my seat. My head throbbed, blood trickled down my face, and every muscle in my body screamed in pain. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and through the shattered windshield, I could see nothing but black sky and the faint glow of my truck's hazard lights reflecting off the wet road. I coughed, tasting blood, and tried to move. My legs were pinned under the dashboard. It took me a minute to understand that I was alive. I had survived the crash. But that wasn't the worst part. I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense, a feeling, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just shock or paranoia. But then I saw them. Figures, standing just outside the range of the headlights. Dark shapes, barely visible through the fog, but unmistakably there. I couldn't see their faces, just their outlines, like shadows in the mist. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. I tried to call out, my voice hoarse. No response. They stayed still, almost blending into the fog, as if they weren't really there at all. I fumbled for my phone, but of course, it was smashed in the wreck. I was stuck, injured, alone, and those things, whatever they were, weren't going anywhere. I must have passed out again because the next thing I remember is the sound of sirens and the flash of blue lights. EMTs pulled me from the wreckage, loaded me into an ambulance, and rushed me to the nearest hospital. I tried to tell them about the figures on the road, about the person I had seen, but they chalked it up to a head injury, the shock of the crash. No one believed me. I spent a week in the hospital, recovering from a broken leg, a concussion, and a few cracked ribs. During that time, I had nightmares, visions of that figure standing in the road, of the dark shapes in the fog. It wasn't just the accident replaying in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, closer, clearer. Then, something strange happened. One of the nurses, an older woman who had been working at the hospital for years, overheard me talking to a doctor about the crash. When he left the room, she pulled up a chair next to my bed. "You said it was Highway 191, right?" she asked. I nodded, confused. "I've heard stories about that stretch of road," she said quietly. "It's known for accidents, fatal ones. The people who've died there, some say they never left." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. "There's been a lot of crashes on that highway over the years," she went on. "Most of them happen at night, in bad weather, just like yours. People say they see things, figures, shadows, just like you did, and then they crash. Sometimes they survive, like you. Sometimes they don't." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She gave me a sad smile. "I'm saying you're not the first to see them, and you won't be the last." I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just a story, but deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever I had seen on that road wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't just a freak accident. A few days after I was discharged, I drove back out to that stretch of highway. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But as I passed the spot where the accident had happened, I felt it again, that gnawing sense of unease. And for just a second, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something in the fog. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I haven't driven that stretch of Highway 191 since, and I don't plan to. My name is Dave Harper, and this story happened during a cross-country trip in the summer of 2010. I was driving my RV along Route 22, heading toward a small town in northern Colorado. It was supposed to be a peaceful road trip, a way to clear my head after a tough few months at work. The open road always gave me a sense of freedom, and I thought I'd be able to forget my troubles for a while. Little did I know, that trip would become the most terrifying experience of my life. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun had just begun to set, when I spotted an old station wagon pulled over on the side of the road. The hood was up, and an older man was standing next to it, waving frantically for help. At first, I thought about driving past. Something about it didn't feel right. But against my better judgment, I decided to pull over and offer assistance. After all, I had some basic tools and enough experience to help someone in a pinch. The man looked relieved as I approached. He introduced himself as Frank and claimed to have been stuck there for hours after his car overheated. I offered to give him a lift to the nearest town, and he gratefully accepted. As we continued on, the scenery grew darker, and the road stretched endlessly through the barren plains. That's when I noticed something odd. Another car was trailing us, its headlights barely visible in the fading light. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another traveler. But as time went on, the car remained close, matching my speed. Frank started to shift uneasily in his seat, and I could feel the tension growing. "You know that car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He shook his head, but I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. Minutes passed, and the car showed no sign of leaving. Then, out of nowhere, it sped up and overtook us, only to swerve in front and block the road ahead. My heart pounded as two men got out of the car, armed and ready for trouble. "Don't get out," I told Frank, but before I could say more, the passenger door flew open, and one of the men yanked Frank out of the seat. Another grabbed me, pulling me from behind the wheel. I struggled, but the cold steel of a gun pressed against my neck quickly convinced me to stop. They forced us into their car and sped off, leaving my RV stranded on the side of the road. I had no idea where they were taking us. Frank was pale, his hands trembling as we sat in the back seat, exchanging terrified glances. The men in the front didn't say a word, only exchanged nods as they drove deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The landscape became more isolated, fields, hills, and not a single soul in sight. My pulse was racing. Every instinct I had told me this wasn't going to end well. They eventually turned off the main highway, taking us down a narrow dirt road. My mind raced, trying to figure out some way to escape, but with guns at our backs, there was little we could do. The car came to a stop in a desolate area, far from any sign of life. The only sound was the wind howling across the open plains. They dragged us out and threw us to the ground. One of the men, a tall guy with a shaved head, pointed his gun at us. "You two had a bad day, didn't you?" he sneered, his voice cold and mocking. The other guy, stockier with a cruel smirk, kicked dirt in our faces. I could barely look up, my face pressed to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. Frank was shaking next to me, murmuring something under his breath, a prayer maybe. Then, the tall man raised his gun, and my entire body tensed. Was this it? Was this how it ended? I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. Bang! I flinched, waiting for the pain, waiting for my life to flash before my eyes. But nothing came. Slowly, I opened my eyes and saw the gunman grinning, the barrel pointed at the dirt just inches from my face. He had fired at the ground to scare us. "You're lucky," he said with a laugh, his breath reeking of alcohol. "It's your new birthday today. You're reborn, man." I didn't understand what he meant, but I was too shaken to care. The other guy joined in on the laughter, mocking us as we lay there, terrified and helpless. "Let's go," the taller man finally said, and with that, they hopped back into their car, leaving us lying in the dirt. The roar of their engine faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Frank and I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. We were too scared to even breathe, afraid they might return. After what seemed like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, we finally mustered the courage to sit up. The relief of being alive washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a deep, gnawing fear. We were in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, no transportation, and the sun had completely set. "We need to get back to the road," Frank whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, helping him to his feet. We were both bruised and exhausted, but somehow we managed to trudge our way back to the highway, where we flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind older couple, gave us a ride to the nearest town, where we were finally able to call the police. When we arrived at the sheriff's office, we told them everything. How we had been kidnapped, how the men had threatened us, and how they had left us for dead. The sheriff took it seriously and sent out a patrol to search the area. My RV was found 2 miles from where we'd been dumped, abandoned but unharmed. Frank and I were shaken, but alive. The next morning, Frank and I parted ways. He had had enough and was taking a bus back home. As for me, I wanted to continue my journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of that gun, the twisted smile of the man who had toyed with our lives. Even now, years later, I think about that night. It changed me. I used to love the open road, the freedom of driving without a care in the world. But after what happened on Route 22, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if those men had decided not to let us go? That question will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, one last hurrah before life took over. Luke had recently graduated from college and, before starting his new job in Denver, he decided to take a solo drive from his home in Chicago to visit his old high school friends in Boulder, Colorado. The plan was straightforward: break the drive into a few days, explore some interesting spots, and enjoy the freedom of the open road. He'd always loved driving alone, the solitude offering him time to think, to reset. Luke had carefully planned his route, aiming to stop at small towns along the way, those forgotten places in the Midwest with quaint diners, antique shops, and the occasional roadside oddity. His first day went smoothly. The sun hung high in the sky as he cruised along the highway, his car windows down, music blaring. By late afternoon, he pulled into a small town on the outskirts of Iowa, stopped for some food, and refueled before continuing his journey. As night began to fall, the scenery grew increasingly barren. The highway stretched out ahead of him like an endless ribbon, cutting through wide, empty fields. The only lights came from the distant glow of far-off towns or the occasional flicker of a gas station. That's when the isolation hit him. He hadn't seen another car for miles. Luke decided it was time to find a place to rest for the night. Spotting a small, flickering neon sign in the distance, he pulled off the highway and into a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 1980s. It was a simple structure, 2 old gas pumps under a dimly lit awning, with a small convenience store attached. The area was deserted, save for an old pickup truck parked around the side. The place felt isolated, almost too quiet. Luke parked his car, stepped out, and stretched his legs. The chill of the night air prickled his skin, and he suddenly felt an odd unease creeping over him. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the eerie stillness. He filled up the gas tank and walked toward the store, the door creaking open as he stepped inside. The store was empty. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the shelves. A bored-looking cashier, an older man with a scruffy beard and a trucker cap, stood behind the counter, staring blankly at an old television that was playing some static-filled program. "Evening," Luke muttered, as he made his way toward the back, grabbing a couple of snacks and a soda. When he returned to the counter, he noticed the man was now eyeing him intently. "Where you headed?" the cashier asked in a raspy voice, his gaze shifting between Luke and the dark highway outside. "Boulder," Luke replied, trying to sound casual. "Visiting some friends." The man gave a slow nod, but his expression remained unchanged. "You be careful out there," he muttered as he handed Luke his change. "Roads get strange at night." Luke forced a smile, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, thanks. Will do." He stepped back outside, the chilly air hitting him once more. As he made his way to his car, he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine. A black SUV had pulled into the lot, parking a few spaces away from his car. The windows were heavily tinted, too dark to see inside. Luke felt his pulse quicken. There hadn't been a car on the road for miles, and now, out of nowhere, this vehicle appeared? He got into his car quickly, trying to shake off the paranoia. Maybe someone else was just stopping for gas. No big deal. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He glanced at the SUV again. It remained still, its engine off, its windows dark. Luke put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, getting back onto the highway. A few minutes passed, and Luke began to relax again, convincing himself that he was being ridiculous. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw headlights in the rearview mirror. The SUV was behind him. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. His heart pounded as the SUV gained on him, its headlights growing larger, closer. Luke accelerated, hoping to lose it. But the SUV matched his speed, staying right on his tail. His palms grew slick with sweat as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Was this really happening? He'd heard stories, people being followed on highways, sometimes for miles. But this was something else. Every time Luke sped up, the SUV did the same. Every time he slowed down, so did the vehicle. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He quickly glanced at his phone. No service. The empty field stretched out on both sides of the road, offering no hope of escape. His GPS had lost signal, leaving him to navigate the deserted road on his own. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights flickered. It swerved slightly, as if the driver was playing with him. A wave of panic surged through Luke. His thoughts raced. Should he stop, try to confront them, or keep driving and hope they'd eventually give up? But then, the SUV swerved again, this time pulling into the other lane. Luke's heart raced. Was it trying to pass him? His question was answered when the SUV roared forward, pulling up alongside his car, matching his speed. Luke glanced to the side, but the windows were still too dark to see inside. And then it happened. The SUV veered sharply into Luke's lane, trying to force him off the road. Luke jerked the wheel to the right, barely avoiding a collision. His car swerved wildly, the tires screeching as he fought to maintain control. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing with terror. The SUV pulled back, falling in behind him once more. Luke was running out of options. He couldn't outrun them forever. His eyes scanned the dark horizon, looking for any sign of help. A town, a rest stop, another car. But there was nothing. And then, up ahead, he saw it. A small roadside diner, its neon sign glowing faintly in the night. Without thinking, Luke jerked the wheel and pulled off the highway, speeding into the diner's gravel lot. He came to a screeching stop near the entrance and threw the car into park. The SUV roared past on the highway, its engine howling as it disappeared into the night. Luke sat there, his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped, for now. He stumbled out of the car and rushed into the diner, his legs trembling with adrenaline. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress behind the counter and an older man sitting in one of the booths. "Are you okay, hun?" the waitress asked, her eyes widening when she saw his pale face and wild expression. I think someone was trying to run me off the road," Luke stammered, still trying to catch his breath. He quickly explained what had happened, but as he spoke, he realized how insane it sounded. A black SUV with no visible driver chasing him down a deserted highway? Who would believe that? The waitress nodded slowly, her face grim. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "We've heard about things like this happening on these roads. Strange cars, strange people, always at night." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "People go missing sometimes," the waitress replied, glancing nervously out the window. "Cars vanish. Bodies are found miles away. No one knows why, but it's been happening for years. The police can never explain it." Luke swallowed hard, a sickening realization washing over him. He had narrowly escaped becoming one of those stories. For the rest of the night, Luke stayed at the diner, unable to bring himself to get back on the road. When morning finally came, he cautiously made his way to Boulder, driving in daylight, constantly checking his rearview mirror. He made it to his friend's house, but the trip had changed him. The carefree excitement of his road trip had been replaced by a lingering fear that stayed with him for months. Even after reporting the incident to the local authorities, who shrugged it off as a case of road rage, Luke knew that night on the empty highway was something far more sinister. He never drove those roads alone again. The sun was setting as Ethan drove down the winding back roads of rural West Virginia. He had always loved exploring new places, venturing off the beaten path. But this time, it felt different, eerily different. He had planned a quick trip to visit an old high school friend, Mason, who lived in a remote town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, leaving Ethan to rely on his instincts and a paper map he'd grabbed from a gas station earlier. But now, it was clear. He had made a wrong turn somewhere. The road had narrowed significantly, and the dense trees pressed in from both sides, casting long shadows that made it feel like the forest was swallowing him whole. Ethan glanced at his gas gauge. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty. Panic started to creep in, but he tried to stay calm. Just ahead, he spotted a dirt road veering off to the right. There was a weathered sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds, that read, "Elmswood Gas and Supplies, 3 miles." With no other option, Ethan turned onto the bumpy road, which snaked deeper into the woods. Every mile felt longer than the last, and his mind kept drifting to horror stories he'd heard about backwoods communities. Isolated, lawless places where outsiders weren't welcome. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was being paranoid. Finally, the trees parted, and he arrived at a clearing. The gas station was a dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in decades. The pumps were ancient, rusted relics of a bygone era. An old, beat-up pickup truck sat on the side, its windows filthy and the tires flat. Ethan hesitated, but he was out of options. He parked the car and got out. As he approached the station, An old man with grizzled hair and a sunken face stepped out from behind the counter inside, moving slowly as if every bone in his body creaked. His pale eyes fixed on Ethan, and a shiver ran down Ethan's spine. "Need some gas?" the old man rasped, eyeing him suspiciously. "Yeah," Ethan replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm a little lost, trying to get to Copper Ridge." The old man grunted. "You're way off, boy. Copper Ridge is about 40 miles west, and the roads out here ain't too friendly after dark." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Can you at least point me in the right direction after I fill up?" The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he shuffled over to the pump, but as he did, Ethan noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A woman stood at the side of the building, half hidden in the shadows. She was watching him, her dark eyes glinting unnaturally in the fading light. She didn't smile or speak, just stood there, staring. The old man finished pumping the gas and returned to the counter inside the station. But as Ethan handed him a few bills, he noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles, no other signs of life around. The place seemed frozen in time, like a forgotten relic. "You'd better leave quick, son," the old man said under his breath as he handed back the change. "Ain't safe here when night falls." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, the woman from outside appeared in the doorway. She was younger than the old man, but her eyes were hollow, as if life had been drained out of her. "You should stay," she said softly. "It's dangerous out there. Real dangerous." Ethan glanced at her, then back at the old man, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. His gut screamed at him to leave, but he forced a polite smile. "Thanks, but I think I'll get back on the road." As he turned to leave, a loud thud echoed from the back of the station, followed by muffled whispers. Ethan froze. There was something, or someone, else back there. Without waiting to find out, he quickened his pace toward the car, his heart racing. He could feel eyes boring into his back, and the air felt thicker, like the entire clearing was pressing down on him. Ethan climbed into his car, started the engine, and hit the gas. The station quickly disappeared behind him, but as he sped down the road, something in his rearview mirror caught his eye. Figures, several of them, standing at the edge of the trees watching him. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The dirt road seemed longer now, winding endlessly through the forest. The trees loomed closer, and the darkness was swallowing the last remnants of daylight. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tried to navigate the twists and turns. But after what felt like hours of driving, Ethan realized something horrifying. He was back at the gas station. It was impossible. He had driven straight the entire time, but there it was. The dilapidated building, the rusted pumps, and the same old truck sitting by the side. The woman was still standing there, staring at him, only now she wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the trees, silent and ghost-like. They were all watching, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized he was trapped. No matter which way he turned, the road always led him back here. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel in frustration and fear. He had no idea what these people wanted or how to escape. Suddenly, the figures began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they stepped closer to the car. The old man stood in front, his expression unreadable. Ethan threw the car into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as he tried to back away. But the figures kept coming, their footsteps eerily synchronized, their faces expressionless. Ethan's mind raced. Was this some kind of twisted game? A trap he had unknowingly walked into? He had no time to think. As they closed in, he hit the gas pedal hard, speeding down the road once again, his heart racing with desperation. But no matter how far he drove, he knew deep down he would never escape. The road always led back to Elmswood. And as the darkness swallowed his car whole, he understood one terrifying truth. Sometimes, a wrong turn isn't just a mistake. It's a fate you can't escape. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I had been driving through rural Pennsylvania, on my way to visit an old friend. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the open fields. I had my music on, the windows down, and nothing but miles of road ahead of me. I was on a detour. Some roadwork had blocked the highway, so my GPS was recalculating, suggesting a shortcut through back roads.
I didn't think much of it. I like taking the scenic route anyway. But after an hour, the road narrowed, and the fields gave way to thick woods. The GPS signal dropped, and before I realized it, I was driving deeper into nowhere, surrounded by trees on all sides. The asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt, and finally, it felt like I was driving on nothing but roots and rocks. I tried to turn back, but there wasn't a good place to make a U-turn. The light was fading fast, and my unease grew with each passing minute. I pressed forward, hoping the road would lead to a town, or at least another highway. That's when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead. In the middle of it, an old barn with peeling red paint. Next to it, an old farmhouse, the kind you'd expect to be abandoned. But there was a single light on in one of the windows. I debated with myself. Should I stop and ask for directions, or just keep driving and hope to find a main road? Something told me to keep going, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I pulled over, cut the engine, and got out of the car.
The evening air was heavy and still, not even the sound of insects. As I approached the house, I noticed a truck parked out front, rusted, with its tires half sunken into the earth. It didn't look like it had moved in years, but the light was still on. I knocked on the door, hoping for some friendly local who could point me back to civilization. The door creaked open a few inches, and a man stepped out, tall and broad, wearing dirty overalls and a worn baseball cap. His eyes were narrow, and his mouth pulled into a tight line. He looked me over like he was sizing me up. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, my GPS cut out and I'm trying to get back to the highway," I explained, forcing a smile to hide my nervousness. "Think you could give me directions?" He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hand gripping the doorframe. After what felt like forever, he nodded slowly. "Sure, come on inside. We can get you a map." Something about the way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have just thanked him and left, but instead, I followed him inside. The house smelled musty, like damp wood and stale air. It was dark, the only light coming from an old lamp in the corner. The furniture was worn, and the walls were lined with hunting trophies, deer heads, antlers, and even a few stuffed birds. As I stepped further into the room, I noticed movement from the shadows. More people. 3 men and 1 woman sat around a wooden table, staring at me with blank expressions. They looked rough, like they'd been living hard lives in isolation. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that made you feel like you were a deer that had wandered into a lion's den. "You lost?" one of the men asked, echoing the words of the first guy. "Yeah, just looking for the highway," I said, my voice feeling too loud in the quiet room. The first man, the one who had opened the door, stood behind me now, and I felt boxed in. I glanced at the door, considering my options, but the way they were all looking at me made it clear that leaving wasn't going to be easy. "You're a long way from the highway," the woman said, still smiling. "Why don't you sit down, have a drink? We don't get many visitors around here." I shook my head. "Thanks, but I really should get back on the road before it gets too dark." The man behind me placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to make me understand that I wasn't leaving yet. "Stay a while," he said softly, but there was nothing gentle about the way he said it. "It's a dangerous place to be out after dark." My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I felt trapped. The men around the table were staring at me, their eyes cold, unreadable. Something was very wrong here. "I really should go," I said, trying to pull away from the man's grip. "Thanks for the offer, but..." The woman stood up suddenly, cutting me off. "We insist." That's when I saw it, the glint of a knife on the table, half hidden under a dirty rag. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew then that I had walked into something I couldn't talk my way out of. The man behind me squeezed my shoulder harder, and I winced from the pain. The others rose slowly from their chairs, closing in around me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. There was no phone service, no one else around for miles, and I was completely outnumbered. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaky now. "Just tell me how to get back to the road, and I'll be on my way." The woman's smile faded, replaced by something far more sinister. "You ain't going nowhere, boy." I moved before I even realized what I was doing, jerking out of the man's grip and bolting for the door. I heard shouts behind me, the scrape of chairs, and the heavy thud of boots on the wooden floor as they chased me. My heart pounded in my chest as I threw the door open and sprinted toward my car. But they were faster. One of the men tackled me from behind, slamming me to the ground. Pain shot through my side as I hit the dirt, gasping for breath. I kicked and struggled, but two of them pinned me down, their hands rough and unforgiving. The woman stood over me now, her face calm, almost bored. "We don't like people snooping around here," she said, her voice cold. "You made a mistake coming this way." I fought harder, panic surging through me, but they held me down, their hands tightening around my arms and legs. One of them pulled out a length of rope, and I knew what was coming next. Suddenly, the distant rumble of a car engine echoed through the clearing. The group paused, their grip on me loosening slightly as they exchanged wary glances. "What's that?" one of the men muttered, looking toward the road. Before anyone could react, headlights pierced through the trees, illuminating the clearing. The engine grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, a large truck pulled up, its horn blaring. "Who the hell is that?" the woman snarled, eyes narrowing as the truck rolled to a stop just a few yards away. The doors flew open, and two men stepped out. They looked like hikers, backpacks, rugged clothes, the works. They glanced at me on the ground, tied up and surrounded by the group, and their faces hardened with realization. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, his voice tense. The group around me tensed up, clearly not expecting this interruption. The woman's expression flickered with anger, but she quickly masked it, trying to appear calm. "Just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "Our friend here got lost and we were helping him out." The hiker didn't look convinced. "Doesn't look like he's being helped to me." The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel the group wavering. They were outnumbered now, and the hikers didn't seem like the kind of people to back down easily. One of the men near me cursed under his breath and reluctantly untied the rope around my wrists. "Get out of here," he muttered. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and ran toward the hikers. As I passed the truck, I glanced back at the group standing in the doorway, their eyes filled with cold fury. "Let's go," one of the hikers said, nodding toward the road. "We'll take you to the nearest town." I nodded, too shaken to speak, and climbed into the truck. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the farmhouse disappearing into the darkness. I knew I had barely escaped something terrible. I would never forget the faces of the people in that house, and I vowed never to take another detour again. It was supposed to be a routine road trip, nothing out of the ordinary. Caleb and Emma were heading back from a weekend hiking trip, cruising down the interstate through the vast desert of Nevada. They'd left late, and by the time they were halfway home, the sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the road ahead blanketed in darkness. Caleb had always loved driving at night. Something about the quiet emptiness of the road calmed him. But that night, the silence felt different. The highway seemed endless, stretching into the void. With Emma dozing off in the passenger seat, Caleb realized they hadn't seen another car for miles. His GPS had lost signal hours ago, and now they were relying on intuition and highway signs to get home. That was when he noticed it, the low fuel light blinking on the dashboard. "Damn it," Caleb muttered under his breath, checking the dashboard again. He had been too focused on the drive to notice the tank running low. They needed gas soon. He slowed the car down, scanning for any signs of a town or gas station. About 10 minutes later, an old battered sign appeared on the side of the road, pointing down a narrow, unmarked exit. It read, "Dry Creek, 5 miles." Emma stirred awake as the car turned off the highway, the sudden change of direction pulling her from sleep. "Where are we?" she asked groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Fuel's low. Saw a sign for a place called Dry Creek. Should be close." The road grew rougher as they continued. The desert, vast and empty, was shrouded in darkness, making it hard to see beyond the faint beams of the headlights. It was too quiet. No sounds of crickets or even the usual hum of wind sweeping across the barren land. Just an unsettling silence. Finally, after a few miles of bumpy, desolate road, the outline of a small town appeared on the horizon. Dry Creek. It was an old, forgotten town that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The buildings were weathered, the windows boarded up, and the streets were completely empty. Not a single light flickered in any of the homes or shops. "This doesn't feel right," Emma whispered, a shiver running down her spine. Caleb nodded but pulled into what appeared to be a gas station at the edge of town. The pump looked old and rusted, barely functional, but it was their only option. He stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin as he approached the pump. He half expected it not to work, but to his relief, the nozzle sputtered to life, slowly filling the tank. As he waited, Caleb scanned the darkened street. There was no movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of the abandoned town. He could feel eyes on him, though he knew it was impossible. There was no one around, or so it seemed. Emma rolled down her window. "Hurry up, this place is giving me the creeps." "Almost done," Caleb said, glancing back at the town. His gut told him something was off. It felt like they had stumbled into a place time had forgotten. Just as the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, Caleb heard a faint creak. He turned toward the noise and saw movement in one of the buildings. A shadow flickered past one of the boarded-up windows of a house across the street. "Did you see that?" Caleb asked, heart pounding. Emma sat up straighter. "See what?" Before Caleb could respond, the door of the gas station behind him slowly creaked open. A soft rustling sound emerged from inside. He felt a chill creep up his spine. For a moment he considered going inside to check it out, but something told him that was a terrible idea. "Get in the car," Emma said, her voice trembling. Caleb didn't argue. He quickly replaced the nozzle, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the car. The engine roared to life, but just as he began to pull away, they both saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the street, watching them. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the figure looked wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its body slightly hunched, and it just stood there, staring. "What the hell is that?" Emma whispered, fear evident in her voice. "I don't know," Caleb muttered, stepping harder on the gas. As they sped down the narrow road back toward the highway, Emma kept looking over her shoulder. "It's still there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb didn't dare look back. His focus was on getting as far away from that place as possible. But as they drove, something even stranger happened. The road didn't seem to end. It twisted and turned, but no matter how far they went, the town of Dry Creek remained in their rearview mirror, just on the edge of their sight. It was like they were trapped in some kind of loop. "I don't understand," Caleb muttered, panic starting to creep into his voice. "We should have hit the highway by now." Emma gripped his arm. "Just keep going." They drove for what felt like hours, but no matter how fast they went, Dry Creek stayed behind them, never getting farther away. The figure from before seemed to multiply, shadows appearing along the side of the road, all watching, all waiting. Their grotesque shapes lurked just outside the reach of the headlights. "We have to stop!" Emma screamed, unable to hold back her fear anymore. "No!" Caleb shouted, but the car suddenly sputtered, the engine choking before completely dying. He tried the ignition again and again, but the car wouldn't start. "Caleb," Emma whispered, looking around. The shadows were closing in, creeping toward the car from all sides. The air felt heavy, and a strange hum filled their ears, growing louder with each second. Then, from the darkness, came a soft, raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Caleb and Emma whipped around, but no one was there. The voice was all around them, echoing in the night. Slowly, shapes emerged from the shadows, figures twisted and distorted, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Run!" Caleb screamed, grabbing Emma's hand. They bolted from the car, sprinting down the road, but it was no use. No matter how far they ran, the town stayed behind them. The figures followed, silent and relentless. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing onto the dusty road, hearts pounding in their chests. And that's when they realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. They had taken a wrong turn, and now they were part of Dry Creek, a place where the lost never leave. I remember that winter night as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was 11 years old, living on the outskirts of a small, remote town in Alaska. Our house was on a lonely stretch, nestled between towering pines and barren winter fields. Snow piled up on either side of the road like walls. And at night, the darkness felt endless, only occasionally broken by the faint glow of our porch light. It was one of those nights when everything felt still, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the crackle of the wood-burning stove in our living room. My mom had just left for her night shift at the hospital, and my dad was away on a work trip. I was alone, but that wasn't unusual. In Alaska, you grow up learning to handle isolation. I was settled in with a blanket and a book when there was a loud knock on the door. The sound echoed through the empty house, making me jump. I put my book down and stared at the door, the heavy silence now broken by a second knock, this one louder and more insistent. Through the peephole, I saw a man, bundled in thick, heavy winter gear, a coat, scarf, and a beanie pulled low over his head. His face was red from the cold, and he held his hands to his mouth, blowing into them as if trying to warm them up. He looked like any traveler who might have gotten lost, or whose car might have broken down on the side of the road. But something in me hesitated. He knocked again, and then I heard his muffled voice through the door. "Hey there, sorry to bother you, but my car broke down a little way up the road. Any chance I could come in to warm up and maybe use a phone?" He sounded polite enough, even friendly, but as I watched him, an uneasy feeling grew in my stomach. Maybe it was the way he looked around, his eyes flickering to the windows, the dark trees, then back to the door, as if he were sizing up the place. Still, it was freezing outside, and my parents had always taught me to be helpful. I told myself I was overreacting and opened the door, though I kept the chain on. "I can call someone for you," I said, hoping he wouldn't insist on coming inside. But his eyes, cold and pale, held mine longer than I was comfortable with. "Thanks, kid, but it'd be a lot easier if I could just come in for a second. I won't be long, I swear," he said, his voice dropping, almost too calm. "I can get the phone and bring it to you here," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady for someone who felt a knot of fear growing tighter. He hesitated, his gaze hardening. "Come on," he said, his tone shifting to something darker. "It's freezing out here. I just need a few minutes." The way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a demand. Suddenly he leaned forward, putting his hand on the door, and for a second, I thought he was going to force his way in. I took a step back, holding the door firmly. "That's okay," I stammered. "I'm calling for help now. They should be here soon." But he didn't budge, and the small smile he gave me was anything but friendly. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he muttered under his breath. His eyes scanned the room behind me, lingering a bit too long on the darkness at my back. For a long moment, he stood there, his gaze chilling me more than the winter air. And then, he slowly backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving mine. Just as I thought he might finally give up, he spoke again, his voice even lower and more menacing. "You know, being alone out here isn't safe," he said. "You never know who might show up, or what they're capable of." My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral, refusing to show fear. I tightened my grip on the door, not daring to break eye contact. He seemed to study me, waiting, perhaps hoping that I'd let my guard down, but I didn't move. Eventually, with a small, twisted smirk, he turned and disappeared into the night, his shadow blending with the trees. I bolted the door and waited, listening intently, but there was only silence. Yet the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too oppressive. I checked every window, every lock, pacing the room, knowing I wouldn't feel safe until morning. Hours later, as dawn broke and the weak sunlight touched the snow outside, I finally dared to venture out. There, by the front door, were footprints, his footprints. They circled the house multiple times, leading from the woods to my windows and back again. And on one window, smudged by his hand, was a note, scratched in the frost. "I'll see you soon." I never saw the stranger again, but that night left its mark. To this day, the memory of that face, of those icy eyes watching from the shadows, lingers. Alaska has its own dangers, I learned that winter. And sometimes, the biggest threats aren't the animals or the elements. They're the people who come out of the dark, friendly on the surface but hiding something far colder beneath. It was around midnight when I found myself driving along a narrow, desolate road in Alaska, thick pines on either side casting long shadows across my headlights. I'd been on the road for hours, nothing but static on the radio and the hum of the engine to keep me company. I had about another 100 miles to go before reaching Fairbanks, where I'd planned to crash at a friend's place. The road was eerily empty. Not another car in sight, and not a single house light pierced through the thick darkness beyond the pines. I knew this route was infamous for its isolation, but something about the sheer emptiness that night felt different. Wrong, somehow. I was about halfway through a winding stretch when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. Just standing there. The man looked like he'd been dropped in from another world, wearing a thick dark coat and an old-fashioned hat pulled low over his face. His head was slightly bowed, but as my car approached, he raised his face to look straight at me. I couldn't make out any details, just two faint glints in his eyes catching the light of my car. The sight sent a chill through me, but I tried to shake it off. I slowed down slightly, half thinking maybe he needed help, though a voice inside told me to keep driving. Just as I was passing him, he lifted his arm and pointed down the road, his finger tracing a long, invisible line into the dark. I caught a glimpse of his face in the light, pale and expressionless, his eyes dark pits that seemed to suck the warmth right out of me. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, leaving him in my rearview mirror as quickly as possible. But as I rounded the next bend, I realized he'd been pointing in the direction of a rusted old truck, parked just off the shoulder, partially hidden by the trees. Its headlights flicked on as I approached, blinding me for a moment before they turned off again. My heart pounded as I drove past it, keeping my eyes straight ahead. The last thing I wanted was to stop or look back. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, my high beams cutting through the blackness. But then, I saw headlights flash behind me. The truck had pulled out onto the road, and its lights were growing brighter, gaining on me. At first, I kept a steady pace, hoping they'd pass. But the truck matched my speed, maintaining a perfect distance, always just a bit too close. I could feel my anxiety start to spiral, each shadow on the road looking like it might hide another figure. The headlights flashed again, this time brighter, their intensity filling the inside of my car. I put my foot down, speeding up until I was hitting nearly 80. But the truck just kept following, the rumble of its engine a constant, menacing drone behind me. Just then, the road took a sharp turn. I eased off the gas, hoping to stay in control, but the truck sped up and surged forward, closing the distance between us. I could feel the weight of its headlights on me, piercing through the back windshield, and my mind spun with images of that silent figure by the road. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared, and it swerved into the other lane, coming up alongside me. I kept my gaze straight ahead, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to block out the figure I felt staring at me from the other vehicle. The truck stayed beside me for what felt like ages, and then, just as quickly, it swerved back behind me, its headlights disappearing. I dared a quick glance in the rearview mirror, but it was gone. The road behind me was as empty as if nothing had ever been there. I didn't ease off the gas until I saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A small, empty rest stop came into view, and I pulled over, hoping a moment to breathe would clear my head. I stepped out of the car, my hands shaking as I leaned against the door. The icy air hit me, sharp and real, grounding me. Then, in the silence, I heard it, the faint hum of an engine. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Only the trees, their dark shapes swaying slightly in the wind. I got back in my car and drove the last stretch without stopping or looking back, the echo of that silent figure and the truck's blinding lights still haunting me. When I finally pulled into Fairbanks, I felt as though I'd barely made it out of the darkness. That road, that night, it left a mark on me. When I told my friend about the experience, he gave me a strange look. "You saw a truck, huh? And a man on the side of the road?" he asked, his face darkening. He told me stories of that road, whispers about a phantom truck and a figure by the roadside who'd been haunting drivers for years. Apparently, the stories all started with a fatal accident decades ago. A trucker, they said, whose body had never been found in the wreckage, only his hat lying in the snow beside the road. The thought still gives me chills. Emma, Alex, Jason, and Kira had been planning their Alaskan adventure for months. They were all drawn to the allure of the untouched wilderness, the frozen lakes, and the chance to escape their everyday lives. Camping out by a remote lake sounded like the perfect adventure. After hours of traveling, they finally arrived at the frozen lake just before noon. The low-hanging winter sun barely pierced through the thick gray clouds overhead, casting an eerie, cold light across the endless expanse of snow and ice. "Just us and nature," Alex declared, tossing his backpack onto the snow. "There's really no one else around." Setting up camp on the edge of the lake, they pitched their tents under tall, snow-laden pines. As night fell, they gathered around a small fire, enjoying the rare tranquility of the untouched wilderness, with nothing but the shimmering northern lights overhead. But the quiet wouldn't last. Late into their first night, the silence was broken by the faint crunching of footsteps through the snow. They assumed it was an animal, maybe a moose or even a wolf, but soon a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and rugged with a short beard and dressed in muted gray clothes that almost blended into the night, stepped forward. "Sorry to intrude," he said with a disarming smile, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I got lost while looking for my camp and ended up here by mistake." The friends exchanged surprised glances, but the man's friendly demeanor quickly put them at ease. He introduced himself as Mike and explained that he was also here for the winter scenery and fishing, but had somehow wandered off the trail. They invited him to join them by the fire, offering him a cup of coffee as he recounted tales of his solo adventures in the wild. There was something mesmerizing about the way he spoke, his voice calm but tinged with a strange, almost hypnotic undertone. But by morning, he was gone. No sign of his camp or his things, not even a footprint in the snow. Shrugging it off as a harmless quirk, the group continued their plans. The next night, however, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, Jason noticed strange footprints circling their tents. The tracks seemed to weave in and out between the trees, as if someone had been watching them as they slept. Just as he shared this discovery, a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of their camp. It was barely visible against the darkened tree line, but the unmistakable sensation of being watched gripped them. "Is that Mike?" Emma whispered, clutching Alex's arm. But the figure didn't respond. It melted back into the forest, leaving the group with a deep sense of dread. "We need to leave," Alex insisted, grabbing his gear with trembling hands. The others didn't argue. There was an unspoken fear that had settled among them, gnawing at their nerves. As they packed in frantic silence and set off along the snowy trail, an oppressive, lurking feeling began to build. Shadows flitted between the trees, following them just out of sight. Kira stole a glance behind her and saw several faint shapes moving parallel to them. Their pursuers were patient, methodical, never revealing themselves fully, but never allowing the group a moment's peace. Hours later, frozen and exhausted, they stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin tucked between dense pines. Its windows were covered in frost, its walls decayed and warped. With no other choice, they dashed inside, barricading the door with a heavy table and anything else they could find. The cabin was dark and smelled of mildew, the air thick with a sense of abandonment and decay. But barely minutes after they entered, a knock echoed through the small space. "Hey, it's me, Mike. Let me in, guys. It's freezing out here." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but something in his tone chilled them to the bone. Outside the door, they could make out his silhouette, and behind him, several others shifting in the darkness. "We're not letting you in," Alex shouted, his voice shaking. There was silence, then a low chuckle from Mike. "You really think you'll last out here without help?" His voice was ice cold, carrying a twisted amusement. "We could have all been friends, but now it's too late." The silence was replaced by pounding on the walls and windows. The shadows outside began pressing closer, their fists and heavy bodies slamming against the frail wooden structure. Desperate, Alex grabbed an iron rod he'd found on the floor, while Jason picked up a broken chair leg as a weapon. Emma and Kira huddled together, fear etched into their faces as the relentless assault continued. When the door finally splintered under the weight of a shoulder, the attackers began forcing their way inside. In a desperate bid to survive, the friends fought back with everything they had, swinging makeshift weapons against their faceless attackers, each hit meeting resistance as if they were striking solid ice. The sounds of struggle filled the cabin, fear driving their movements even as their strength waned. Then, a sudden burst of light flooded the room. A second group of campers, drawn by the noise and commotion, had come to investigate. They rushed in, joining the fight, and managed to push the attackers back long enough for everyone to escape into the freezing night. Together, they made their way out of the woods and didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, collapsing in exhaustion and terror. The next day, they reported everything to the local police, detailing their harrowing encounter. No one had ever heard of a Mike or any solo campers in that area, and while the police found no evidence to corroborate their story, the experience would forever mark them. That winter night in the Alaskan wilderness served as a stark reminder. Sometimes the wild harbors far more than animals and icy winds. Sometimes it conceals people who are predators in the most terrifying sense of the word. My name is Sarah, and just a few months ago, I thought I'd be starting an exciting new chapter in my life. After getting into a great university, I found a cozy, affordable apartment close to campus. Moving away from my small hometown felt liberating, and I was ready for a fresh start. But that sense of freedom quickly faded, replaced by something much darker. It started out as little things. I'd notice my neighbor from down the hall, an unassuming man in his 40s, always seeming to be around whenever I left my apartment. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he just had a similar schedule. But he'd linger a little too long, his gaze following me down the hall, his smile a little too wide. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. A few days later, I found a small, neatly wrapped gift outside my door. Inside was a necklace, simple and elegant, but certainly not something I'd wear. Confused, I left it on my kitchen counter, unsure of who might have left it. Later that day, I received a message from an unknown number. "Did you like the gift?" My stomach dropped. I didn't remember giving my number to anyone in the building. I ignored the message, but that night, I heard footsteps outside my door, the shuffle of shoes pausing just outside, as if listening. The uneasy feeling crept in deeper, and I kept all my lights off, too scared to make a sound. The next day, there was another gift waiting. This time, it was a single, dried-up rose. The petals were crisp, flaking off as I picked it up, sending a wave of dread through me. I knew who had left it. My neighbor's strange behavior, the messages, the footsteps. It was becoming clear he was fixated on me. I decided to confront him the next time I saw him, thinking that perhaps setting firm boundaries would put an end to this strange behavior. When I finally saw him, I tried to be assertive, telling him I didn't appreciate the gifts and wanted to be left alone. His smile faded, but he nodded and mumbled something I couldn't make out before turning back to his apartment. I'd hoped it was over, but I was wrong. That night, my phone buzzed again. "You shouldn't be so rude. You don't understand how much I care." After that, things escalated quickly. Strange, unsettling items began showing up at my door. Animal bones, a scrap of fabric torn from one of my shirts that had mysteriously gone missing from my laundry, and even a photograph of me, taken from a low angle, as if from the stairwell. I was terrified. I reached out to the police, but they were dismissive, saying there was no clear threat. Friends told me to relax, that maybe I was just stressed from moving to a new place, or that maybe he just had a harmless crush. I felt trapped, powerless, as if my pleas for help were invisible. Days turned into weeks, and the surveillance only intensified. I'd catch glimpses of him watching from across the street, or lingering in the parking lot as if waiting for me. At night, the same footsteps would stop outside my door, closer and closer each time. I was too scared to confront him again, terrified of what he might do if I angered him further. I began isolating myself, stopped attending classes, and barely ate or slept. The paranoia was consuming me. I didn't feel safe anywhere. Then came the night that changed everything. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, too tense to sleep. I heard the familiar creak of footsteps in the hallway, but this time, they didn't stop. Instead, I heard a quiet scratching sound, followed by a faint click. My blood ran cold as I realized he was picking the lock. Panicked, I scrambled to my feet, frantically searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My hands shook as I clutched my phone, dialing 911 as quietly as I could, praying they'd arrive in time. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his eyes wild, his face twisted into a deranged smile. "I knew you'd finally let me in," he whispered, inching toward me with an unsettling calm. There was a sick, possessive look in his eyes, and I knew he wasn't here for any good reason. I backed away, trying to keep space between us, my voice a trembling whisper as I begged him to leave. But he just kept coming, murmuring things I couldn't fully understand, his tone both affectionate and threatening. With the operator still on the line, I threw the phone aside and fought back, shoving past him and running toward the door. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back with a force that sent me stumbling, but I twisted out of his grip, adrenaline kicking in as I screamed at the top of my lungs. I managed to escape into the hallway, where my neighbors had finally come out, startled by the commotion. Just as he lunged after me, the distant sound of police sirens echoed down the street, and he stopped, a look of furious frustration on his face as he realized his time was up. The officers arrived moments later, restraining him as he struggled and screamed, his rage spilling out in incoherent threats. I collapsed against the wall, overwhelmed with relief, but shaking uncontrollably. In the following days, I learned he had a history of stalking and harassing women, and that I wasn't his first victim. The ordeal left a permanent scar on me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, as though he left behind a shadow that still clings to my life. Every knock on the door, every creak of the floorboards, every passing stranger fills me with a lingering dread that's impossible to escape. He may be gone, but his presence has left me forever haunted. My name is Lisa, and not too long ago, I moved to a small remote village, hoping to escape the rush of the city. Since I was a kid, I'd always dreamed of living somewhere secluded, and this house in the woods seemed like the perfect place, especially in winter when everything is blanketed in snow and the village is hushed in quiet. For the first few weeks, I enjoyed the peace. In the evenings, I'd take short walks, and the fresh, cold air helped me unwind after work. One evening, as I was heading home, I noticed a car parked nearby. In the darkness, a man sat at the wheel, staring at me intently. I quickly walked by, feeling his eyes follow me. He didn't try to speak, just kept watching until I disappeared inside. The next evening, it happened again, and this time, an uneasy feeling washed over me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a coincidence or some sort of misunderstanding. But this man's gaze was unsettling. And it went on like this nearly every night. He'd park in different spots nearby, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. But I knew he was watching. Occasionally, he'd disappear for a day or two, only to reappear, making the tension build even more. The snow was falling heavily, and one morning, I noticed footprints around my house. They led to the kitchen window and back to the road, where I found cigarette butts stamped into the snow. My heart sank. I had a gut feeling it was him. That night, I barely slept, straining to hear every sound in the house. At first, I didn't tell anyone. It just seemed too surreal to say out loud, and I didn't want anyone to think I was paranoid. But the anxiety was growing. A few days later, I saw footprints again, this time right on my porch, leading up to my bedroom window. Someone had been standing there, watching me as I slept. I called the police, but they told me there was nothing they could do without clear evidence of a break-in or an attempt to harm me. I tried talking to the neighbors, but they brushed it off as my imagination. No one had seen a suspicious car or noticed anything unusual, Meanwhile, my nights became a tense waiting game. I could no longer sleep soundly, alert to every tiny noise. One evening, when I looked out the window, I saw the car again. This time, it was parked even closer, right near my driveway, and in the headlights, I finally saw his face. He was a man with a cold, hard expression, staring straight at my house. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, I bought a small camera and set it up near the window, hoping it would provide some sense of safety, or at least record something I could show to the police. But when I checked the footage the next day, I found that the camera had been switched off. Someone had come inside and didn't want to be seen. That realization chilled me to the core. Days passed, and my life turned into a constant watch. I only went outside when absolutely necessary, scanning for his car each time. Then, one night, when I peered out the window, there he was again, parked on the same street. My heart froze. He didn't make any moves toward me, just sat in the car, as if he knew that I knew, and that there was nothing I could do. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he vanished. No more cars, no more footprints, no more cigarette butts. But the fear has stayed with me. I still check the windows every night, and every sound makes my heart race. I'm Emily, a graduate student in my early 20s, and last year I moved to a new city for school and work. It was supposed to be the start of something new, a fresh start after years of feeling stuck. I didn't know many people here, so I joined an online dating app, just to see if maybe I could meet someone interesting. That's how I met Nick. At first, he was charming, attentive, witty, and easy to talk to. We had similar interests, and he didn't push for a meetup right away, which I found refreshing. After a few weeks of casual conversations, he asked me out, and I figured, why not? We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a busy part of town. The first date went smoothly. Nick was exactly as I imagined. He was kind and funny, and there were no strange vibes at all. We talked about everything: books, travel, our shared interest in photography. I went home that night thinking I'd like to see him again. We started dating casually. But a couple of weeks in, something about Nick seemed to change. It was subtle at first, almost like he was trying to test the waters. He'd make offhand comments about where I'd been the day before, which was odd since I hadn't told him. When I asked him about it, he laughed it off, saying he just knew me well enough to guess. It struck me as strange, but I brushed it off as overthinking. Then, one evening, I was out with friends and saw his car parked a block away from the restaurant. I checked my phone to see if I'd missed a message from him, thinking maybe he'd happened to be in the area, but there was nothing. I spent the rest of the night feeling uneasy, noticing his car on my way home. When I asked him about it the next day, he just smiled and said he'd been keeping an eye out to make sure I was safe. That comment hit me hard, and over the next few days, I started feeling like I was being watched more often than not. Whenever I went out, it seemed like he was just around the corner, just passing by. He started texting me, asking why I hadn't told him about my plans with friends, or asking why I wasn't answering his messages immediately. It felt like my life was becoming his business, and he didn't even bother to hide his irritation if I didn't respond fast enough. The change in his tone made me feel trapped, but I was hesitant to cut things off. I wasn't even sure if I was imagining things. The day after I'd decided to take some space, I noticed something outside my apartment. There, on my doorstep, was a small bouquet of flowers. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was a neighbor's delivery mistake. But then I saw the note. In neat, precise handwriting, it read, "I always know where you are." My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe he would go this far, but who else could it be? I called Nick, confronting him, but he denied everything, laughing it off as some weird coincidence. The denial only added to my fear, like he was playing a game where he'd always be one step ahead. That night, I started checking my windows, making sure all my locks were secure. The feeling of someone watching me intensified, and I couldn't shake the thought that he was somewhere close. Days passed, and his texts got worse. They went from "good morning" to "why are you ignoring me?" and "I saw you left work early. Where were you?" I had never told him where I worked. It was a job I'd picked up after our first date. I felt sick. I decided to go to the police, but with nothing concrete, they couldn't do much. They suggested I block him and file a report, but I was scared of what he might do if I cut him off completely. The next week, I started noticing cigarette butts near my apartment building, exactly by my bedroom window. I knew he didn't smoke, but it was like he'd taken up the habit just to stand out there at night. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of a silhouette from my window, a figure in the shadows that would disappear the second I'd look closer. I was losing sleep, and every knock on my door sent a shock through my body. One evening, after another long, restless day, I checked my phone and saw dozens of missed calls from him. The messages were frantic, angry, like he was completely unraveling. "You can't just ignore me, Emily. You think I won't find you? I know your schedule better than you do." Chilled, I knew I had to get help. I called a friend and asked her to come over, explaining everything as quickly as I could. She insisted I stay with her for the night, but before I left, I decided to check my windows and door one last time. That's when I saw his car, parked across the street. And then, I saw him get out, looking up, watching. I froze. The horror of realizing that he'd been planning this, following me, knowing every detail of my life, hit me with full force. I grabbed my things and ran out the back exit, meeting my friend down the block. We drove straight to the police station, where I filed another report. This time, with the text messages and a description of his recent behavior, they took me seriously. I never saw Nick after that night. He disappeared from my life as quickly as he'd entered it, leaving me with lingering fears that sometimes keep me up at night. But not long after, the police informed me that when they searched his apartment, they found walls lined with photos of me, carefully taken from a distance, and piles of notes detailing every part of my life. He'd kept meticulous records of my routines, when I left for work, the places I frequented, even details as small as the brand of coffee I drank. He'd been studying me, tracking my every move like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to piece together. I moved to a new apartment with better security, and I avoid dating apps entirely now. To this day, I don't go anywhere without feeling like someone's eyes are on me, like his shadow is waiting for a chance to reappear. Hi, I'm Tom, and today I'm going to share a story that happened to me, a story I'll never forget. I'd been fascinated by the supernatural since I was a kid. The idea of uncovering hidden secrets and sharing them with the world drove me. So, when I finally gathered a small crew of friends to film an investigation of an old abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town, I was ecstatic. This was my first real shot to show off my skills, inspired by the videos of seasoned paranormal explorers who fearlessly ventured into the unknown. The cemetery was the perfect place for our investigation. I'd heard rumors that it was haunted, with stories about sightings of shadowy figures and whispers that chilled the blood of anyone foolish enough to listen. The path leading there was a winding, narrow road barely lit by the moon, with overgrown trees and weeds that seemed to close in around us as we got closer. When we finally arrived, the sight was surreal. Ancient tombstones leaned at odd angles, cracked and crumbling, barely holding on to their inscriptions. The few mausoleums were decrepit, with roofs partially caved in and iron gates rusted beyond repair. But my friends weren't taking it seriously. They were there for the thrill, laughing and nudging each other as they told each other ghost stories. I tried to keep my nerves in check, telling myself that it was just an old cemetery and that the shadows were only trees and stones playing tricks under the moonlight. But something in the air felt wrong, a heavy silence that wrapped around us, pressing down as if the earth itself didn't want us there. "Hey Tom, this is your big chance to impress us." Mark, one of my friends, grinned as he patted my shoulder. "Why don't you go up to that creepy mausoleum over there? You're the paranormal expert after all." They all laughed, their voices echoing across the empty cemetery. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't back down. I had to prove that I could handle this, even if I was starting to wish we'd just stayed home. So, I forced a smile and headed toward the looming structure, a mausoleum where, according to a local legend, a victim of a brutal, unsolved murder was buried. The entrance was partially blocked by rusty iron bars, which clanged as I pushed against them. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of mold and damp stone. I took out my flashlight and scanned the walls, which were covered in strange carvings that looked like they'd been scratched in with crude tools. Behind me, I could hear my friends laughing and daring each other to come closer, but none of them did. They were waiting for me to find something to spook them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by ghosts, but by someone very real. As I stepped closer to the back of the mausoleum, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. My pulse quickened, and I shined my flashlight around, but all I saw was darkness. I was about to call out to my friends when something heavy dropped behind me with a dull thud. I spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, imposing man with a shotgun in his hands, pointed right at me. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me with cold, steady eyes. My breath hitched, and I tried to speak, to explain that we were just kids exploring, but my voice caught in my throat. I glanced over at my friends, expecting one of them to jump in and help, but to my shock, they were already scattering, sprinting off into the darkness, leaving me behind. "Kids like you got no business here." The man's voice was low and rough, almost drowned by the pounding of my heart. I took a step back, nearly tripping over the stones scattered across the mausoleum floor. "Last warning, get out." I managed to stammer out an apology and slowly backed away, hoping he wouldn't shoot. But as I turned to leave, the man's face twisted into a cold smile. "If you're still here when I count to 5, you'll be part of this graveyard." His words sent a shock through my body, and without another thought, I bolted, adrenaline pushing me forward as fast as I could go. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if he was following me. My only thought was to get out and find my friends. But the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever in the darkness, twisting paths leading me nowhere. The laughter I'd heard from my friends earlier was gone. Now, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I called out, hoping that maybe one of them had waited, but there was only silence. My phone's flashlight was dimming, the battery close to dying. Panic was starting to take hold as I stumbled through the maze of gravestones, looking for any sign of the exit. Then, in the distance, I saw a faint light, a flashlight maybe, or the glow of a phone. I ran toward it, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't one of my friends. It was the same man, standing completely still, his shotgun propped against his shoulder. He wasn't moving, just watching, waiting. The realization that he was hurting me, pushing me deeper into the cemetery, made me feel trapped, helpless. Desperately, I turned and ran in the opposite direction, not caring where it led me, as long as it was away from him. After what felt like hours, I found myself back at the entrance, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. My friends were nowhere in sight. They'd all abandoned me, leaving me alone with this nightmare. But I didn't care about them anymore. I just wanted to be safe. I stumbled back onto the path that led to the main road, my mind racing with disbelief and anger. They'd left me there, left me to face that man alone, all for a stupid dare. And as I finally reached the road, the headlights of a passing car illuminated the path behind me for a brief moment. I turned, half expecting to see the man watching me from the cemetery gates. But there was nothing there. Only darkness and silence, the way it had been before we arrived. That night changed everything. I never spoke to those friends again, never returned their calls or messages. They didn't understand what had happened, didn't realize how close I'd come to being another name on one of those tombstones. I continued my interest in the paranormal, but after that night I became far more cautious, choosing my friends carefully and avoiding empty promises of bravery. Hi, I'm Mike. I grew up in a quiet town where everyone knew each other. For us, the old cemetery at the town's edge was something of a local legend. The place was filled with old gravestones, twisted trees, and a kind of silence that felt heavy, almost like someone was always watching. My mom would sometimes bring me there on Memorial Days, and while I'd help her, I always wanted to leave as soon as possible. The cemetery had this strange, eerie stillness that never sat well with me. When I got older, a few kids at school started getting into this stupid game of daring each other to go there at night. They'd go in alone or in pairs, looking for creepy carvings on the headstones or climbing on the old crypts. Word got around that a couple of kids even spent the night once, though I never quite believed that story. Eventually, it was my turn. They dared me to go there alone at night, record it all on my phone, and bring it back to prove I wasn't scared. I wanted to say no, but my pride got the best of me, and before I knew it, I was walking toward the cemetery just as the sun dipped below the trees. With the sky darkening fast, I stepped through the rusty gates and felt my stomach tighten. The place was as unsettling as ever, but this time, the shadows stretched longer, merging with the graves and trees, giving the impression that I was in some forgotten world. I pulled out my phone and started recording, narrating to make it seem like I wasn't as scared as I actually was. "See? Nothing here," I whispered to the camera, hoping my voice didn't betray my nerves. As I moved deeper, a sudden rustling made me freeze. I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal. I walked further until I was near the biggest crypt in the cemetery, where a couple of my so-called friends had said they'd found strange carvings before. As I inspected the stone walls, I heard footsteps, quiet but steady, crunching the leaves somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw a few dark shapes darting behind the gravestones. I recognized their outlines. It was them. They had come to watch, probably planning to scare me for laughs. Trying to play along, I called out, "All right, you got me. I know you're out there." But there was no response. No laughter, no shuffling, nothing. I laughed it off and continued with my recording. But just as I was about to turn back toward the entrance, a whisper floated from the darkness. It was soft, but sharp, like someone hissing my name. "Alex." I froze, realizing that none of my friends knew I'd be coming alone tonight. They were all supposed to be at a party. Just then, I heard footsteps rushing toward me, and I was ready to bolt. But then I recognized one of the faces. It was Jack, one of the guys from the Dare. He grinned, his face a mix of amusement and something else I couldn't quite place. "Come on, Alex," he said with a smirk. "You didn't think it'd be this easy, right?" He motioned to the others, who stepped out from the shadows. They seemed off, like they were taking this dare far more seriously than I'd thought they would. "All right, you've had your fun. I did it," I said, trying to laugh it off and head back to the gate. But they blocked my way, their faces suddenly hard and unsmiling. Jack crossed his arms and nodded toward an open grave nearby. "The real dare's not over yet. Show us how brave you are. Lie down in there, just for a minute." A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't back down now. Their eyes were fixed on me, expecting me to chicken out. Trying to stay calm, I lowered myself into the grave, lying back on the cold earth. The damp, heavy air pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. My friends closed in around the edge, their faces looking down at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "All right, you've seen enough," I said, sitting up. But just as I was about to climb out, they started to pile heavy stones over the opening, laughing. At first, I thought they were just joking around. But as the rocks kept piling, blocking out the light bit by bit, panic took hold. I could barely breathe, my voice echoing off the walls of the grave as I yelled, "Guys, this isn't funny anymore! Let me out!" Silence. Not a single laugh or movement from above. I could feel the weight of the stones pressing down, every breath getting shorter. I started pounding the walls, yelling for help. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as I lay there, heart pounding, until I heard a muffled voice. A voice that didn't belong to my friends. "Hey, are you all right down there?" There was a scuffle above, then hands reached down to pull me out. I looked up, dazed, into the face of a man I'd never seen before. He was passing through and heard my screams. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his face etched with concern. Looking around, I realized my friends had vanished, leaving me alone with a stranger in the dark, empty cemetery. The man walked me home, and we never spoke of it again. The next day I confronted Jack, but he just shrugged, saying, You wanted to prove you weren't afraid, right? Since that night, the memory of that grave never left me. I learned that friends who push you to prove yourself at the cost of your safety aren't friends at all. I stopped hanging around them, but the shadows of that night stayed, a reminder of what fear and a twisted sense of loyalty can drive people to do. When I returned to my hometown after losing my job, I was pretty much at rock bottom. The small town where I grew up didn't have much to offer in terms of opportunities, so I started looking for anything that could keep me afloat. That's when I saw a job listing for a night watchman position at the cemetery. I thought it would be temporary, a quiet, solitary job where I could gather my thoughts and plan my next steps. The first few nights were quiet and uneventful. I walked along the winding paths, getting used to the silence and the shadows cast by the old headstones. After a few shifts, I found myself at ease in the dark, even appreciating the solitude that the graveyard offered. It was just me, the stars, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. What once felt eerie became peaceful in a strange way. One night, however, when I was finishing my final round, the atmosphere changed suddenly. The air, which was usually crisp and cold, became dense and heavy, as if a damp fog had rolled in. The familiar paths of the cemetery seemed distorted, the headstones looming larger and more menacingly. Shadows twisted unnaturally, and I started to feel an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The cemetery, which had begun to feel almost like a place of calm, turned hostile, as though it was urging me to leave. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder and hoping that whatever was unsettling me would disappear. Just as I was about to turn down the last path toward the gate, I felt a sudden, forceful shove against my back. I stumbled forward, barely managing to catch myself before hitting the ground. My heart froze. Spinning around, I expected to see someone standing there, but the path was empty. Only the darkness surrounded me, deeper and heavier than before. My hands trembled as I brushed off my clothes, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd tripped, maybe I'd imagined it. But then, as I took a step forward, I saw him. A tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged from the shadows a few yards ahead, standing perfectly still between two grave markers. The man's face was cold and expressionless, his eyes dark and piercing. He looked straight at me, his stare boring into me with a chilling intensity. And then, slowly, a twisted smile crept onto his face. "You're too late to leave," he said, his voice a rough whisper that seemed to scrape against the night air. "You're staying here now." I could feel the blood drain from my face as panic took hold. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, my feet crunching on the gravel as I ran deeper into the cemetery, barely able to breathe. I could hear his slow, steady footsteps behind me, unhurried, as if he knew that no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape him. I pushed myself to keep going, my lungs burning, but every path I took seemed to wind back around, leading me further into the maze of gravestones and twisted trees. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears as I ran, desperate to find a way out. In the dim moonlight, I saw the looming silhouette of an old, decrepit crypt, and I ducked behind it, crouching low, hoping he'd pass by without noticing me. But the footsteps stopped. I peeked out, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw him standing just a few feet away, looking right in my direction, as if he'd known where I'd hide all along. Frozen in terror, I watched as he took a step forward, and another, his cold smile never wavering. Just when I thought I'd reached the end, something caught my eye. There, standing near one of the gravestones, was a girl, no older than 13. Her dress was simple, and her expression calm, almost serene, contrasting starkly with the terror I felt. She met my gaze and motioned for me to come closer. Her presence was strangely soothing, an anchor in the chaos of the night. "Let's go," she said softly, reaching out her hand. "I'll take you out of here." I hesitated, glancing back to see the man watching us, his smile fading as he took a step back into the shadows, seeming almost afraid of her. I didn't need to be told twice. I took the girl's hand, and an unexpected warmth flowed through me, calming my panicked breaths. She guided me down a winding path, every turn feeling deliberate, like she knew this place as well as I knew the streets of my hometown. She didn't say much, just a few murmured words about the souls resting here, but somehow I felt safe. As we neared the cemetery gate, she released my hand. I turned to thank her, offering to walk her home, but she shook her head with a gentle smile. "I'm already where I need to be," she whispered, and with a glance back at the tombstones, she faded away, her form dissolving into the night. The next morning, still shaken, I told my story to my coworker, expecting disbelief or laughter. Instead, he listened quietly, his face growing solemn as I mentioned the girl. "You saw her near the old graves?" he asked, almost in a whisper. He went on to explain that she was a known spirit of the cemetery, a girl who had died young and was said to protect people who lost their way in the dark, those who were respectful anyway. Since that night, I've made a habit of leaving a small flower at her grave each time I work the night shift, a quiet gesture of thanks to the girl who saved me. Now, whenever I pass her grave, I feel a faint warmth, a gentle reminder that in this place of rest and mystery, I have a protector, and I know that no matter how dark the night may get, I'm never truly alone. The rugged peaks of northern New Mexico rose against the fading sky, a remote paradise where Emma and her friends had planned a peaceful weekend getaway. The group had been excited to escape the daily grind, hiking deep into the Carson National Forest along the Williams Lake Trail. Their destination was a secluded campsite near the tree line, where they would spend the next few days hiking, exploring, and relaxing. Emma, along with her friends, Jason, Matt, and Sarah, felt the weight of the outside world fall away as they set up camp. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The day had been perfect, but as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. After dinner, they gathered around a crackling fire, enjoying the isolation. The silence of the forest was peaceful at first, but slowly it turned oppressive. The usual sounds of wildlife, crickets, rustling leaves, seemed to vanish all at once, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Did anyone hear that?" Jason asked, breaking the uneasy silence. His voice was barely a whisper. Emma frowned. She hadn't heard anything, but there was something about Jason's tone that set her on edge. They all fell silent, listening closely. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a low, almost melodic whistle drifted from the darkness beyond their camp, a sound that wasn't quite like the wind, yet not fully human either. "Probably just an animal," Matt said, though his voice lacked confidence. But then the whistle came again, louder this time, followed by something else, an eerie cry that echoed through the trees, cutting through the stillness like a jagged knife. It was a sound Emma had never heard before, something primal and unnatural. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jason stood abruptly, shining his flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. The beam swept through the trees, revealing only shadows. He lingered on a particular spot just beyond the firelight. "Did you guys see that?" Jason asked, his voice rising. Before anyone could respond, Emma saw it too, a figure moving unnaturally fast between the trees, there one moment and gone the next. It was dark, almost like a shadow, but there was something wrong about it. Its movements were jerky, inhuman. Without thinking, Matt leaped to his feet and sprinted toward the figure. "Matt, no!" Emma shouted, but he was already gone, crashing through the underbrush. The others jumped up, panic surging through the group. "What is he doing?" Sarah gasped, grabbing Emma's arm. Jason pointed his flashlight toward the trail Matt had taken, but it was useless. The forest swallowed him whole. The sound of Matt's footsteps quickly faded, and soon there was only silence again. Emma's heart pounded as she strained to hear something, anything from the woods. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the darkness, a high-pitched scream. It was Matt. "We have to go after him," Emma said, her voice trembling. "He's in trouble." Jason nodded, already grabbing his pack and a flashlight. The three of them hurried after Matt, following the direction of the scream. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, the thick trees blotting out the moonlight, leaving them in near total darkness. The strange whistling sound returned, this time closer, circling them as if the forest itself was alive. Jason led the way, his flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. "Matt!" he shouted, his voice desperate. But there was no answer. just the eerie sounds of the forest. They ran deeper into the woods, the trail disappearing beneath their feet. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, fear tightening around her like a vice. The night seemed to press in on them, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a branch made her flinch. Then, out of nowhere, they found him, Matt, standing in the middle of a small clearing, his back to them. He was unnaturally still, facing the tree line. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood up. "Matt?" Jason called, cautiously approaching. Matt didn't respond. "Something's wrong," Emma whispered, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. Jason edged closer and reached out to touch Matt's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Matt's head jerked around, his eyes wide and glassy. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a raspy, distorted voice, mimicking Matt's tone but wrong. Horribly wrong. "Help me!" Matt's voice echoed, though his lips barely moved. Emma's blood ran cold. That wasn't Matt. Whatever stood in front of them was wearing his face, but it wasn't him. Jason stumbled back in horror as the figure twisted unnaturally, its limbs cracking and contorting. The Matt figure let out a guttural growl before it bolted into the woods with inhuman speed, disappearing into the night. "We have to get out of here," Jason gasped, backing away from the clearing. "That wasn't him." Emma nodded, her mind racing. They had to go back to camp, pack up and leave before whatever was out there found them again. They turned and sprinted through the forest, the trees blurring past as panic drove them forward. But as they ran, the sounds of the whistling and growling followed them, always just behind, as though something was hunting them, herding them deeper into the woods. By the time they reached the camp, everything felt wrong. Their tents were torn open and strange animal-like tracks surrounded the area. Sarah collapsed near the fire, sobbing. "What is happening?" Before anyone could respond, the forest fell silent again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she looked toward the trees. She could feel it. The thing that had taken Matt was watching them, waiting for its moment. "We need to leave now," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. She grabbed her backpack and started packing, her hands shaking. Just as they were about to leave, the figure reappeared at the edge of the clearing, standing unnaturally still, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It no longer looked like Matt, but something far more sinister, something ancient and malevolent, wearing a grotesque, twisted version of his face. Without a word, the three of them bolted, fleeing into the dark woods. The creature's footsteps followed closely behind, its low growl echoing through the night. Emma's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, but she knew they couldn't outrun it forever. They stumbled onto a narrow mountain trail, but the creature was relentless. It lunged at them from the shadows, forcing them to fight for their lives. Jason swung a heavy branch at it, but it barely slowed the thing down. It was playing with them, toying with its prey. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The creature stopped just at the tree line, watching as they collapsed onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. They had escaped, for now. But Emma knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The mountains of New Mexico held many secrets, and they had barely scratched the surface. Jake's truck kicked up a trail of dust as he drove down the desolate road toward the small town of Red Mesa, perched on the edge of the Navajo reservation. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the vast desert landscape. He hadn't been here in years, not since he was a kid visiting his uncle during summer breaks. Now, older, and with a thirst for something different, Jake had decided to spend a week with his relatives. He wasn't expecting anything special, just some peace and quiet away from the city. But the town had changed. Something felt off. Red Mesa was small, just a few scattered houses, a diner, a gas station, and the dry, unending desert that stretched out toward the reservation. As Jake pulled into his uncle's driveway, he couldn't shake the eerie quiet of the place. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the weight of the silence, like the town was holding its breath. That night, as Jake sat around the dinner table with his Uncle Henry and Cousin Maria, the conversation turned to the strange happenings in the area. "People are saying it's back," Henry muttered, barely looking up from his plate. His voice was low, as if speaking too loudly might draw its attention. "What's back?" Jake asked, curious. Henry exchanged a glance with Maria before leaning back in his chair. "The Skinwalker." Jake had heard the stories before. He remembered the tales as ghost stories told around campfires when he was a kid. Creatures that could shapeshift, evil beings that could become animals and humans alike. But those were just stories, right? Maria shuddered. "You think it's just a story, but things have been happening. Livestock disappearing, strange tracks around the town, and at night, there are screams coming from the desert. Not animals, but something else." Jake laughed nervously, brushing it off. "You guys are trying to freak me out. I'm not a kid anymore." His uncle didn't smile. "You'll see." Jake's first few nights in Red Mesa were unsettling. He couldn't sleep. Every night around 2 a.m. he heard it. Strange howls echoing from the desert, far off but distinct. It wasn't the sound of coyotes or wolves. This was something more human, almost like a scream cut short. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the local wildlife, but the sound stuck with him, creeping into his thoughts during the day. The locals were no help. When Jake visited the diner, they whispered about the strange things that had been happening. People were locking their doors at night. Some refused to go out after dark. And then there were the disappearances. A few days before Jake arrived, one of the rancher's cows had been found mutilated, its body torn apart in ways no animal could manage. And just 2 nights ago, a local boy had vanished from his home, with only a set of strange, elongated tracks leading into the desert. "Tracks like a human, but wrong," an old man told Jake in the diner. "Too long, too thin." Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every time he walked through town or went to the outskirts near the desert, he felt eyes on him. One night he decided to take a walk, thinking some fresh air might calm his nerves. The town was quiet, the streets empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. As he reached the edge of town, where the last houses met the open desert, he froze. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the light, right where the town met the reservation land. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall, thin, and completely still. At first, Jake thought it was a person, but something about the way it stood was wrong, unnatural, like its limbs were too long for its body. "Hey!" Jake called out, taking a step toward it. The figure didn't move. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but as soon as he did, it bolted. It didn't run like a person, though. It loped on all fours, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. Jake's heart raced, and he turned back toward his uncle's house, walking quickly, trying not to look over his shoulder. When he got home, he didn't tell his uncle what he saw. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he knew something was wrong. The next day, Jake decided to investigate. He drove out toward the desert, toward the area where the strange tracks had been found. The land out here was harsh and unforgiving. Vast stretches of scrub brush and jagged rocks, with deep ravines cutting through the earth. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. There were no people, no animals, just the wind and the empty land stretching out for miles. Parking his truck near the Bright Angel trailhead, he got out and started walking. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy with an unshakable tension. After a while, he found them, tracks, just like the ones people had been talking about. They were human-shaped, but longer, like someone had stretched the footprints out unnaturally. As he crouched down to get a closer look, a chill ran down his spine. There, in the distance, he heard the scream again, louder this time, closer. Jake stood up quickly, heart pounding, scanning the horizon. He was miles from town, alone in the desert. But he wasn't alone. Something was watching him. As night fell, Jake found himself running. He didn't know where, just away from the sound, away from the presence that seemed to follow him. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the jagged landscape. In the distance, he could see a shape moving, bounding through the darkness toward him. It was faster than anything he'd ever seen. Too fast for a human, too large for an animal. Panicked, Jake stumbled over the rocks and scrub, breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced back, and in the brief flash of his dying flashlight, he saw it. Something between a man and a beast, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was closing in. Jake pushed forward, barely able to think through the terror. He could hear the thing's footsteps now, faster and faster, like it was playing with him. His legs burned, but he couldn't stop. Up ahead, he saw an abandoned cabin, half buried in the sand. Without thinking, he dashed inside, slamming the door behind him. The thing circled the cabin, scratching at the walls, its footsteps heavy on the roof. Jake pressed his back against the door, trying to catch his breath. The night was filled with the sound of claws scraping wood, of whispers in a language he couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. For a long time, Jake sat in silence, waiting, barely daring to breathe. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, he slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The desert was still, the tracks leading away into the distance. Whatever it was gone, for now. But as Jake made his way back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Something ancient and evil lingered in the shadows of Red Mesa, and it wasn't finished with him yet. That night, Jake sat at the dinner table again, this time in silence. He had told his uncle everything. Henry, though unsurprised, looked grave. "You shouldn't have gone out there, Jake. This thing doesn't just stop. Once it's chosen you—" Jake interrupted, trying to hide the panic rising in his chest. "So what? What do I do?" Henry leaned forward, his voice low and trembling. "Leave, Jake. Pack your things and leave town tonight." Jake didn't waste time. Before the sun fully set, he had thrown his belongings into his truck and started the engine. As he drove out of Red Mesa, he looked into the rearview mirror, watching the town disappear behind him. But just as the last house faded from view, his breath caught in his throat. In the mirror, standing in the middle of the road, was the same figure from the night before. It was tall, still, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural glow. This time, it wasn't running. It was waiting. For him. Jake slammed on the gas, speeding into the dark desert night. But deep down, he knew there was no outrunning it. It had chosen him, and now it would follow, always waiting, watching, until it finally made its move. And when it did, Jake wouldn't be ready. Tony had been driving trucks for 5 years, and the desert nights of Arizona never bothered him before. He was used to the solitude, the vast emptiness of the landscape, and the endless stretch of highway illuminated only by his headlights. But tonight was different. It was well past midnight, and Tony was hauling a load of machinery across the long, desolate Route 66, heading toward a delivery in Flagstaff. The desert was quiet, almost too quiet. His truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the barren expanse of sand and rock. The radio crackled with static, every station fading in and out of range. As he drove, Tony began to notice shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, quick, darting movements just beyond the reach of his lights. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. He was tired, and the monotony of the road often played tricks on his mind. But then, he saw it, clear as day. A figure ran across the highway, a shadowy blur moving too fast to be human. Tony slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. The truck screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the asphalt. He sat there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, his breathing heavy. "Did I just see that?" he muttered to himself, hands gripping the steering wheel. He flicked on his high beams and scanned the road ahead. Nothing. The desert stretched on, empty and still. Tony let out a shaky breath and rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept in nearly 20 hours. It was probably just a coyote, or maybe the fatigue messing with his head. But as he started the truck again and drove on, that uneasy feeling lingered. Something wasn't right. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The radio crackled again, this time with a strange rhythmic static. It almost sounded like whispering. Tony glanced at the radio, confused. He fiddled with the dial, but no matter what station he tuned to, the whispering remained. A chill ran down his spine. He reached over and shut the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. Now it was inside the truck, faint but unmistakable. Voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The shadows returned, darting across the road in front of him, flickering in and out of his peripheral vision. Tony's pulse quickened. Something was out there, watching him. Up ahead, the faint glow of an old neon sign appeared on the horizon. A rundown motel, abandoned for years, its sign flickering like a ghost from a forgotten era. The parking lot was empty, and the building was half collapsed. But Tony felt an overwhelming need to stop. He needed to rest, if only for a few hours. He pulled the truck into the lot, the tires crunching over the gravel. The desert wind howled around him as he stepped out of the cab, the sound eerily like a voice calling his name. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Just the wind, he told himself, nothing more. Tony approached the dilapidated motel, the broken windows dark and hollow like empty eye sockets. As he stepped inside the dusty lobby, the temperature seemed to drop, and a sense of unease settled over him like a heavy blanket. The place was deserted, but something about it felt wrong, like he wasn't alone. Ignoring the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, Tony found an old, weathered armchair and sat down, rubbing his eyes. He'd rest for a bit, just until the sun started to rise. He could keep driving after that. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the whispering returned, louder this time, closer. His head snapped up, and his eyes darted around the room. He could have sworn he saw movement in the shadows near the door, a figure standing there watching him. "Hello?" he called, his voice hoarse. No answer. The figure moved closer, and Tony's heart raced. It looked human, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like it didn't quite belong in its own skin. Panicking, Tony bolted from the chair and ran out of the motel, scrambling back into his truck. His hands shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and he floored it, speeding out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. But as he drove, the shadows followed him. In the rearview mirror, he saw them, figures running alongside the truck, their limbs distorted, faces twisted into unnatural shapes. One of them, larger than the rest, was keeping pace with the truck, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. Tony pressed harder on the gas, the truck's engine roaring as he sped through the desert night. His heart pounded in his chest as the whispering filled the cab again, louder now, almost as if it was coming from the figures outside. He glanced at the road ahead and saw another figure standing in the middle of the highway, directly in his path. It was too late to swerve. The truck barreled toward the figure, but just as it was about to collide, the figure vanished. Tony gasped, gripping the wheel as he tried to regain control of the truck, his pulse racing. The radio suddenly crackled to life, and a voice, deep and distorted, whispered his name. "Tony." His stomach dropped. Whatever this thing was, it knew him. It had been watching him. Up ahead, he saw a narrow, winding road that cut through a canyon. Without thinking, he swerved onto it, desperate to lose whatever was following him. The truck careened down the winding road, the steep cliffs rising on either side, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The whispering grew louder, filling his head with strange, twisted words. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. The thing chasing him had changed. No longer just a shadow, it had taken on a shape, a form that was almost human but wrong in every way. Its eyes glowed bright yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was a skinwalker. Tony had heard stories from other truckers, tales of creatures from Navajo legend that could change shape, mimic voices, and hunt people in the night. He never believed them, not until now. The skinwalker was getting closer, its twisted limbs moving at an unnatural speed, its eyes locked on him. Tony's heart pounded in his chest as he floored the gas, trying to outrun it. But the road was narrow, the canyon walls pressing in on either side. Suddenly, the truck hit a sharp turn, and the back wheels skidded, sending the truck sliding dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Tony fought to regain control, his hands slick with sweat, the skinwalker's growls echoing in his ears. Just as the truck began to tip, the skinwalker lunged at the window, its hand slamming against the glass with a sickening thud. Tony screamed, jerking the wheel hard to the left, sending the truck back onto the road. He glanced at the mirror again, but the creature was gone. The whispering had stopped. The desert was silent once more. Tony drove through the night, not daring to stop until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. When he finally pulled into a gas station just outside Flagstaff, he stumbled out of the truck, his hands still shaking. He glanced back at the road, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him from the distance. But there was nothing, just the empty desert stretching on forever.